The night was warm and still when the sloop William appeared off the western coast of Jamaica, her canvas slack in the dying October breeze. She rode low in the water, heavy with stolen cargo and the accumulated sins of a season's plundering. Below deck, in the cramped quarters that stank of bilge water and spilled rum, a man lay sprawled across a hammock, his breath coming in the slow, labored rhythm of the thoroughly intoxicated. His name was John Rackham, though no one called him that anymore. To the merchant captains who feared him, to the colonial governors who wanted him hanged, to the broadsheet printers in London and Boston and Kingston who made their pennies selling tales of pirate terror, he was Calico Jack, named for the garish cotton trousers he wore, striped like a carnival performer's costume, absurd and unmistakable even at a distance. In approximately 6 hours, a heavily armed privateer called the Tiger would come alongside the William in the shallow waters of Negril Point. There would be a brief engagement, though engagement suggests more resistance than actually occurred. The men aboard the William, experienced pirates who had terrorized the Caribbean for months, would scramble below deck to hide among the barrels and anchor chains, leaving only 2 figures on deck to face the boarding party with cutlasses drawn and pistols blazing. Those 2 figures were women. And the man in the hammock, the notorious Calico Jack, the pirate whose flag would one day become perhaps the most recognizable symbol of maritime outlawry in human history. That man would be found cowering in the hold, too drunk to stand, too frightened to fight, waiting for the noose that would claim his life less than a month later. This is not the story you think you know. Or rather, it is that story, but told honestly for once, stripped of the romantic embellishments that have accumulated over 3 centuries like barnacles on a ship's hull. It is the story of how a mediocre, cowardly, chronically underperforming pirate captain became one of the most famous names in the history of maritime crime, a fame built almost entirely on the courage and notoriety of 2 remarkable women he happened to sail with, and on a flag design that would outlive any memory of what he actually did. It is a story about how history chooses its heroes, and how often those choices have nothing to do with heroism at all. To understand how John Rackham arrived at that hammock on that October night in 1720, drunk and doomed and utterly oblivious to the legend he was about to accidentally become, we must go back to the beginning, not to his birth, about which we know almost nothing, but to the world that created him. The early 18th century Caribbean was a place of extraordinary violence, extraordinary wealth, and extraordinary transformation. The great age of piracy that had flourished in the previous century was drawing to a close, not because pirates had become any less numerous or any less bloodthirsty, but because the colonial powers had finally decided to do something about them. The year was 1718, and Woodes Rogers had just arrived in Nassau with a royal commission to clean up the Bahamas. Rogers was a former privateer himself, a man who understood the pirate mind because he had once possessed one. He came bearing a proclamation from King George III. Any pirate who surrendered himself before September of that year would receive a full pardon. No questions asked, no punishment inflicted. Simply walk up to the governor, confess your crimes against the maritime commerce of His Majesty's subjects, and go free. It was an extraordinary offer, and it worked exactly as designed. Pirates who had spent years sailing under the black flag lined up by the hundreds to take the king's pardon. They emerged from the fetid taverns and crowded boarding houses of Nassau like rats from a flooded hold, blinking in the tropical sunlight, suddenly respectable again. Some of them meant it. They took their pardons and found honest work, or at least work that was legal enough to avoid hanging. Others, the smarter ones perhaps, or simply the more cynical, saw the pardon for what it was, a temporary reprieve, a chance to resupply and refit before returning to their old ways under a cleaner conscience. John Rackham was among those who surrendered. We know this because colonial records are nothing if not thorough in their documentation of criminality, and Rackham's name appears on the lists of pardoned pirates in 1718. What we do not know, what no one knows, is where he came from before that moment. There are no birth records, no baptismal certificates, no family trees that stretch back to some English village where a young John Rackham first dreamed of the sea. He simply appears in the historical record in his late 20s, already a pirate, already wearing those ridiculous striped trousers that would give him his nickname. The best guess, and it is only a guess, is that he came from somewhere in the English working class, probably from a port city where the sea was never more than a few streets away. Bristol, perhaps, or Plymouth, or one of the dozen smaller towns where boys grew up watching ships come and go and dreaming of the fortunes that lay beyond the horizon. He would have gone to sea young, as most sailors did, serving on merchant vessels or perhaps naval ships during the wars that seemed to engulf Europe every few years. Somewhere along the way, he would have made the transition from legitimate sailor to pirate, a transition that was, in those days, far less dramatic than modern readers might imagine. The line between privateering and piracy was tissue-thin and often invisible. Privateers were pirates with government permission, licensed to attack enemy shipping during wartime. When peace came, as it periodically did, thousands of experienced fighting sailors suddenly found themselves unemployed, their skills unwanted, their appetites for violence and easy money unchanged. Many of them simply continued doing what they had always done, only now without the legal cover of a letter of marque. The colonial authorities called them pirates and hanged them when they could, but the men themselves often struggled to see the distinction. They had been heroes last year. Now they were criminals. The work was identical. By 1718, Rackham had risen to the position of quartermaster aboard the sloop Kingston, sailing under the command of Charles Vane. This tells us something important about his abilities, or at least about how his fellow pirates perceived them. The quartermaster was an elected position, chosen by the crew to represent their interests and oversee the distribution of plunder. It required a certain cunning, a certain facility with numbers and negotiation, and above all, a certain level of trust from men who trusted almost no one. Rackham had these qualities, apparently, or enough of them to secure the position. Charles Vane was everything Rackham was not, genuinely dangerous, genuinely fearless, and genuinely cruel. He had been one of the most notorious pirates in the Caribbean before the pardon, and his acceptance of the King's grace had been purely tactical, a chance to escape prosecution for past crimes while preparing for future ones. Within weeks of taking the pardon, Vane had returned to piracy with a vengeance, leading his crew on a rampage through the shipping lanes that made him one of the most wanted men in the Western Hemisphere. Rackham served under Vane for several months, and by all accounts, he served competently. He was there when Vane captured merchant vessels off the coast of Cuba. He was there when they took prizes in the Carolina waters. He was there through all of it, accumulating his share of the plunder, building his reputation as a reliable member of Vane's inner circle. But then, something happened. Something that would reveal the fundamental flaw in Calico Jack's character, the weakness that would eventually lead to his undoing in that moonlit bay off Jamaica. In late November of 1718, Vane spotted a sail on the horizon. His lookout quickly identified her as a French warship, heavily armed and crewed by professional naval sailors. Vane, characteristically, ordered his crew to prepare for battle. He saw prize money in that distant hull, or perhaps simply the chance for violence that seemed to animate his every decision. But his crew did not share his enthusiasm. A vote was called. Everything was voted on in pirate ships, from the division of loot to the choice of targets, and the crew voted to flee rather than fight. Vane was furious. In his mind, this was cowardice, a betrayal of everything a pirate was supposed to be. He overruled the vote using his captain's authority to command in time of battle, and he ordered pursuit of the French ship. It was a disastrous decision. The French vessel proved to be not a fat merchant prize, but a genuine man of war, and Vane's sloop barely escaped with her masts intact. By the time they had limped to safety, the crew's anger had crystallized into something more dangerous than mere grumbling. The next day, they voted again. This time, the question was not whether to fight, but whether to continue serving under Charles Vane. The answer was no. By a margin that the records do not specify, but which was clearly substantial, the crew deposed Vane as captain and elected John Rackham in his place. They put Vane and his few loyal supporters into a small prize sloop with minimal supplies and left them to fend for themselves. The mutiny was complete. Here is where the mythology diverges from reality in ways that matter. In the popular telling, Rackham's elevation to captain marks the beginning of a glorious career, the moment when Calico Jack stepped into the spotlight and began his legendary exploits. But look at the circumstances more closely. Look at why the crew chose him. They did not elect Rackham because he was brave. They did not elect him because he was a brilliant tactical commander. They elected him because he had voted against fighting the French warship. They elected him, in other words, because he was cautious to the point of timidity, because he could be counted on never to lead them into danger, because he was fundamentally a coward. This is not an insult. It is simply a fact, borne out by everything that followed. Under Rackham's command, the crew of the former Kingston, now renamed the William, pursued a strategy of almost comical risk aversion. They attacked only the weakest targets, small fishing boats, unarmed merchantmen, vessels so obviously harmless that their capture required no courage whatsoever. When they spotted anything that looked remotely capable of fighting back, they fled. When they encountered any kind of opposition, they negotiated. When all else failed, they hid. The historical record of Rackham's actual piracies is remarkably thin, considering how famous he would become. He captured a few small vessels in the Cuban waters during the winter of 1718 to 1719. He took some cargo, extorted some ransoms, terrorized some fishermen. It was piracy, technically, but it was piracy at its most pathetic, the maritime equivalent of a highwayman who only robbed old women walking alone on country roads. His crew grew restless. They had not deposed Charles Vane so they could spend their days chasing fishing boats for a few barrels of salt cod. By the spring of 1719, Rackham had apparently had enough as well. The reality of pirate captaincy, the constant threat of capture, the deteriorating ships, the increasingly surly crew, had worn through whatever romantic notions he may have entertained. When word reached him that Woodes Rogers was offering a second round of pardons to any pirates willing to surrender, Rackham saw his chance. He sailed the William into Nassau Harbor, struck his colors, and surrendered himself to the colonial authorities. Once again, he was a free man. Once again, he had escaped the consequences of his choices. And once again, the reprieve would prove temporary. Nassau in 1719 was a strange, liminal place, suspended between its disreputable past and its hoped-for respectable future. Woodes Rogers had succeeded, to an extent that surprised everyone, including himself, in transforming the pirate haven into something approximating a functioning colonial settlement. The brothels still operated, and the taverns still served their watered rum, but there was now a semblance of law, a court system, a garrison of soldiers who could be called upon to maintain order. Pirates who had once ruled the streets now walked them as pardoned men, their past crimes officially forgotten, but never truly erased. Rackham found work, as many former pirates did, on merchant vessels making the short runs between the Bahamas and the larger Caribbean ports. It was honest labor, more or less, and it kept him fed and housed. But it must have been a strange existence for a man who had so recently commanded his own ship, voted on by his peers, subject to no authority but the democratic will of his crew. Now he took orders from merchant captains, loaded and unloaded cargo, performed the endless maintenance that kept wooden ships functional in tropical waters. The pay was poor, the work was hard, and the future stretched ahead with nothing to recommend it but more of the same. It was in this context that John Rackham met Anne Bonny, and nothing in his life, or in hers, would ever be the same. Anne Bonny was approximately 20 years old in 1719, though even this basic fact is uncertain. Like Rackham, she had arrived in the historical record without much in the way of documentation, and the stories that would later circulate about her early life have the unmistakable flavor of legend embroidered onto a sparse framework of fact. What we know, or think we know, is this. She was born in Ireland, the illegitimate daughter of a lawyer named William Cormac and a serving woman named Peg Brennan. The scandal of her birth had driven her father to emigrate, taking young Anne with him to the Carolina colony, where he had established himself as a merchant and plantation owner of some success. Anne had grown up wild by all accounts, a red-haired terror who ran through the streets of Charlestown like a boy, fighting and cursing and showing no inclination whatsoever toward the modest domesticity expected of colonial women. There are stories, impossible to verify but persistent enough to suggest some kernel of truth, that she stabbed a serving girl with a dinner knife during a fit of temper. There are other stories about beatings administered to men who made advances she found unwelcome. The portrait that emerges is of a young woman of extraordinary physical courage and equally extraordinary volatility, a person for whom violence was simply another tool in the social toolkit, no more remarkable than speech or gesture. She had married young, as colonial women usually did, but her choice of husband had been disastrous. James Bonny was a small-time sailor, with ambitions that exceeded his abilities, and he had married Anne at least partly in hopes of securing a share of her father's wealth. When William Cormac learned of the marriage, contracted without his permission, with a man he considered utterly unsuitable, he disinherited his daughter on the spot. The young couple found themselves suddenly poor, their plans for easy prosperity in ruins. They drifted south, eventually, to Nassau, where James hoped to find work and Anne hoped to find adventure. What Anne found instead was John Rackham. The details of their meeting are lost to history, though every biographer of either figure has speculated freely about the circumstances. Perhaps it was in one of Nassau's many taverns, where the pardoned pirates gathered to drink and reminisce about their days of glory. Perhaps it was on the waterfront, where Rackham would have been working, and Anne would have been wandering, restless and bored and looking for something, anything, to alleviate the tedium of her marriage. What we know is that they met, that they were immediately and powerfully attracted to each other, and that within a very short time they had embarked on an affair that would scandalize the small colonial settlement. James Bonny was not the sort of man to overlook such an insult. He was also not the sort of man to confront Rackham directly. Calico Jack may have been a coward by pirate standards, but he was still far more dangerous than a merchant sailor, so he took his grievances to the colonial authorities. He filed a formal complaint with Governor Rogers, demanding that Anne be flogged for adultery and forcibly returned to his household. It was exactly the response one might expect from a small, petty man whose pride had been wounded by a woman who preferred someone else. Rogers, to his credit, tried to handle the situation with some delicacy. He summoned Anne to his residence and offered her a choice: submit to punishment and return to her husband, or face the full weight of colonial law. It was meant to be a sobering conversation, a reminder that even in a former pirate haven, there were rules that must be followed, proprieties that must be observed. Anne, characteristically, was not sobered. She refused the offer. She refused to return to James Bonny. She refused, in essence, to accept that any authority had the right to tell her what to do. The consequences of this refusal would have been severe if Anne had remained in Nassau to face them. But she did not remain. Within days of her interview with Rogers, she and Rackham had stolen a sloop from the Nassau harbor. Some accounts say they recruited a small crew, others say they managed the vessel alone, and vanished into the Caribbean night. They left behind James Bonny, left behind the colonial authorities, left behind any pretense of legitimate life. Once again, John Rackham was a pirate, but this time he was not alone. The sloop they had stolen was called the Curlew, a small vessel but seaworthy enough for coastal raiding. Over the next several months, Rackham and Anne established themselves in the waters around Cuba and Hispaniola, taking small prizes and avoiding the naval patrols that swept the region with increasing frequency. It was during this period, probably in the late summer of 1720, that they encountered a ship whose crew included a young sailor named Mark Read. Mark Read was quiet and competent and kept largely to himself, qualities that made him unremarkable among the rough men who crewed pirate vessels. He had been pressed into service, he claimed, taken from a captured merchantman and given the choice between joining the crew or being killed. It was a common enough story, and Rackham had no reason to doubt it. Mark Read became a member of the crew, performing his duties without complaint, contributing to whatever raids and operations the company undertook. Anne Bonny, however, noticed something that Rackham apparently did not. She noticed the delicacy of Mark Read's features, the smoothness of his skin, the particular way he moved when he thought no one was watching. She noticed, in short, that Mark Read was not a man at all. The revelation, when it came, was apparently quite friendly. Anne approached Mark, or as we must now call her, Mary, with a directness that characterized all her interactions. According to the later testimony that would emerge at their trial, Anne was initially attracted to the young sailor and made advances that could only be interpreted one way. Mary, faced with either rejecting Anne outright or revealing her secret, chose revelation. She was a woman, she explained, disguised as a man, as she had been for most of her adult life. She had served as a soldier. She had worked as a sailor. She had passed as male so completely and for so long that the deception had become second nature, no more remarkable to her than breathing. Anne's response to this revelation was apparently delight rather than outrage. Here was a kindred spirit, another woman who had refused to accept the limits that society placed on her sex, another woman who had seized the freedoms normally reserved for men through sheer force of will. They became close friends, then closer, though the exact nature of their relationship remains one of history's enduring mysteries. Were they lovers? The possibility has fascinated and titillated historians for 3 centuries. The evidence is ambiguous, consisting mainly of suggestive comments made by contemporaries, and the simple fact that 18th century observers struggled to categorize the bond between these 2 remarkable women. What is not ambiguous is that Mary Read proved to be everything John Rackham was not. She was brave, she was skilled, she was genuinely dangerous in a way that commanded respect rather than merely inflicting it. In the brief period when she sailed with Rackham's crew, perhaps 6 months, perhaps slightly less, she established a reputation for ferocity that her captain utterly lacked. She fought in boarding actions with a cutlass in one hand and a pistol in the other. She killed men who opposed her. She showed no fear, ever, under any circumstances that the historical record documents. There is a story, possibly apocryphal but consistent with everything else we know about her, that Mary Read once forced a duel with a man who had challenged her lover, a sailor on the crew with whom she had formed an attachment. The man who issued the challenge was apparently a bully, confident in his superior strength, expecting an easy victory. Mary insisted that she fight in her lover's place, and the man agreed, perhaps amused by the prospect of humiliating a woman in front of the assembled crew. The duel was held on a beach, somewhere along the Cuban coast. Mary shot the man through the body before he could raise his pistol, then finished him with her cutlass as he fell. No one ever challenged her again. John Rackham, meanwhile, continued to demonstrate the same qualities that had defined his entire career. He avoided fights whenever possible. He chose targets that could not fight back. He drank heavily, perhaps to dull the awareness that his 2 female crewmates were braver than he would ever be. The crew noticed, of course. They always noticed. But Rackham retained his position because he was useful in other ways. He could navigate, he could negotiate with merchants who fenced stolen goods, he could keep the peace between fractious personalities. And besides, Anne Bonny wanted him there. That counted for more than anyone cared to admit. The summer of 1720 faded into autumn, and the little sloop William, they had acquired her somewhere along the way, a larger and more capable vessel than the Curlew, continued her desultory raids along the Jamaican coast. They took prizes when they found them. Fishing boats mostly, small merchant vessels carrying rum or sugar or molasses. They anchored in hidden coves and celebrated their modest successes with rum and music and whatever other pleasures presented themselves. They were pirates, living the pirate life, free from the constraints of ordinary society. But they were also doomed, and if anyone aboard the William knew it, the knowledge did not seem to temper their behavior. The colonial authorities had not forgotten about Calico Jack Rackham. Governor Nicholas Laws of Jamaica had been receiving complaints from merchants whose vessels had been plundered, and he had finally decided that something must be done. In late October, he commissioned a privateer named Jonathan Barnett to hunt down the William and bring her crew to justice. Barnett was given command of the sloop Tiger, a fast and well-armed vessel crewed by experienced fighters. He was given explicit orders to take the pirates dead or alive, with a preference for alive. Governor Laws wanted the spectacle of a public trial and execution. Barnett found his quarry on the night of October 22, 1720. The William was anchored in a small bay at Negril Point, on the western tip of Jamaica. She was not alone. A small turtle fishing boat was anchored nearby, and Rackham's crew had apparently been celebrating some minor success with the turtle fishermen. The party had been going on for hours. The rum had been flowing freely. By the time the Tiger appeared out of the darkness, most of the pirates aboard the William were too drunk to stand, let alone fight. What happened next would define the legend of Calico Jack Rackham for the next 300 years. It would also reveal, in the starkest possible terms, exactly who he really was. The Tiger came alongside. Barnett hailed the William and demanded to know who commanded her and where she was from. Rackham, still conscious if not exactly sober, shouted back that they were English and that he would come aboard to explain himself. It was a delaying tactic, transparent and pathetic. Barnett ordered his crew to prepare for boarding. The Tiger's guns fired a broadside into the William's rigging, bringing down her boom and eliminating any possibility of escape. Then the privateers swarmed over the rail with cutlasses drawn and murder in their hearts. They found almost no resistance. The pirates, who had terrified merchant sailors for months, had retreated below deck, hiding among the cargo and the anchor chains and the accumulated filth of the hold. Some of them were too drunk to move, others were simply too frightened. A few made gestures toward fighting, but they were quickly overwhelmed. The capture of the William should have been the quickest, least dramatic conclusion to a pirate hunt in Caribbean history. It was not. Because standing on the deck, facing the boarding privateers with weapons ready and defiance in their eyes, were two figures who showed no intention of surrendering. Bonny and Mary Read fought like furies while their male crewmates cowered below. They fired pistols into the advancing privateers, wounded several, possibly killed one or two. When their pistols were empty, they drew cutlasses and continued fighting. They screamed at the men hiding below deck to come up and fight like men. One account claims that Anne fired down into the hold, trying to wound or kill the cowards who had abandoned her. Eventually, of course, they were overwhelmed. There were too many privateers, too few defenders, and neither Anne nor Mary could sustain the fight forever. They were disarmed and bound, along with the shambling remnants of Rackham's crew, who emerged from the hold to face capture. The battle, such as it was over. The William belonged to the King's men now, and everyone aboard her was bound for the gallows. But in those few moments of desperate fighting, Anne, Bonny, and Mary Read had written themselves into history with a vividness that their captain could never match. They had proven something about themselves, about the limits of courage, about what women were capable of when freed from the constraints that society imposed upon them. And John Rackham, cowering in the darkness below, had proven something too. He was exactly what his crew had always known him to be. A man who would flee from danger, who would hide when others fought, who possessed none of the qualities that legend would later attribute to him. The paradox of Calico Jack's fame begins here, in this moment of complete and abject failure. The morning after brought tropical sun and the particular humiliation that only daylight can deliver to the defeated. The prisoners were herded onto the deck of the William, their hands bound, their heads pounding from rum and fear, and the slowly dawning recognition of what awaited them. Jonathan Barnett surveyed his catch with the professional satisfaction of a man who knew exactly what his prize would be worth. Governor Laws would be pleased, the merchants of Jamaica would sleep easier, and the newspapers would have something sensational to print. The journey back to Port Royal took several days, and during those days, the prisoners had ample time to contemplate their fates. They knew what awaited them. Everyone knew what awaited captured pirates. The Caribbean was dotted with the rotting corpses of men who had sailed under black flags, their bodies left hanging in iron cages at the entrances to harbors as warnings to any who might consider following their path. The gibbet was not merely an execution, it was a proclamation, a statement of colonial authority, a reminder that the age of piracy was ending and that the forces of law and commerce would no longer tolerate those who preyed upon them. John Rackham spent those days in the peculiar purgatory of a condemned man who has not yet been formally condemned. He knew he would hang. Everyone knew he would hang. The only questions were when and how publicly, and whether anyone would remember his name afterward. History suggests that he spent at least some of this time with Anne Bonny, though the nature of their conversations remains unrecorded. What do lovers say to each other when they know that death is coming? What recriminations are offered? What forgiveness sought? What final tenderness exchanged? We can only imagine, and our imaginations are inevitably colored by what we know of their characters. Anne, fierce and unbroken even in defeat. John, already fading into the secondary role that history would assign him. The William arrived at Port Royal on November 1720. The prisoners were transferred to the Kingston jail to await trial. Governor Nicholas Laws moved quickly. He wanted his spectacle while the capture was still fresh in the public mind, while the terror of Rackham's brief depredations was still vivid enough to justify the harsh penalties he intended to impose. The trial was scheduled for November 16th, less than 3 weeks after the capture. This was swift justice by any standard, but particularly swift for the colonial Caribbean, where legal proceedings often dragged on for months as witnesses were gathered and evidence assembled. Laws had no intention of allowing such delays. He wanted blood, and he wanted it while the blood of Rackham's victims was still metaphorically warm. The trial took place at St. Iago de la Vega, the old Spanish capital of Jamaica that the English had renamed Spanish Town. It was a handsome colonial settlement, all whitewashed buildings and shaded plazas, a place where the apparatus of empire functioned with relative efficiency, and where the ceremonies of law could be conducted with appropriate solemnity. The courthouse was packed. Everyone wanted to see the pirates, wanted to witness the drama of their condemnation, wanted to be present when justice was delivered. They got rather more than they bargained for. The proceedings against Rackham and his male crew members were straightforward. The evidence was overwhelming. Multiple witnesses testified to their piracies, sailors from captured vessels, merchants who had been robbed, officials who could speak to the terror that the William had spread along Jamaica's northern coast. The defense, such as it was, consisted mainly of pleas that the accused had been forced into piracy, that they were merely sailors following orders, that they had never personally harmed anyone. These arguments convinced no one. The verdict was guilty, the sentence was death, and the condemned men received the news with varying degrees of stoicism. Rackham himself reportedly accepted his fate with what observers described as resignation rather than despair. He had always known this was how it would end. Every pirate knew. The only variations were in the timing and the circumstances, and he had survived longer than many of his contemporaries. He was 38 years old, though he looked older. The Caribbean sun and the sailors' life aged men quickly. He had perhaps 10 more days to live, but the trial of John Rackham and his crew was merely the preliminary act. The real drama, the spectacle that would ensure these proceedings lived on in memory, was yet to come. Bonny and Mary Read were tried separately on November 28, 1720. Their trial drew even larger crowds than Rackham's had, because there was something unprecedented about it, something that challenged fundamental assumptions about gender, about capability, about the proper roles of women in society. Here were two individuals who had not merely violated the laws against piracy, they had violated every law, written and unwritten, that governed how women were supposed to behave. The prosecution laid out its case with careful precision. Bonny and Mary Read had sailed aboard the William in men's clothing. They had participated fully in the crew's piracies. They had fought with weapons, had intimidated victims, had shown themselves as capable of violence as any man aboard. More damningly still, when the ship was captured, they had been the only crew members to offer resistance. They had fought while the men hid. They had embodied a form of courage that the men had lacked. This was not merely piracy. This was inversion, subversion, a challenge to the natural order of things. The prosecution called witnesses. Sailors who had been aboard captured vessels testified that they had seen two women among the pirates, dressed as men, armed with pistols and cutlasses, as fierce and aggressive as any of their male companions. Thomas Dillon, whose canoe had been taken near Harbor Island, described two women who had behaved in common with the other pirates, participating fully in the capture and robbery. Dorothy Thomas, a woman who had been aboard another captured vessel, provided even more specific testimony. She had been taken prisoner aboard the William and had observed Anne and Mary closely. She testified that they wore men's jackets and long trousers, that they each had a machete and pistol, that they cursed and swore with the same fluency as any sailor. When asked how she knew they were women, Dorothy Thomas replied that their breasts were visible, pushing against the fabric of their shirts. They had not tried particularly hard to hide their sex. They had simply dressed in the practical clothing that allowed them to work and fight alongside the men. The defense strategy for Anne and Mary was unusual, and it would prove momentarily effective. Both women pleaded their bellies. They were pregnant, they claimed, and English law prohibited the execution of pregnant women. A pregnant woman could not be hanged until her child was born, on the theory that the innocent life within her should not be destroyed for the sins of the mother. This plea required physical examination, and so Anne, Bonny, and Mary Read were examined by a panel of matrons, older women from the Spanish town community, who were deemed capable of determining whether the accused were truly with child. The matrons confirmed it. Both Anne, Bonny, and Mary Read were pregnant. We do not know, and can never know with certainty, who the fathers were. Anne's child was almost certainly Rackham's. They had been lovers for over a year, and she had been pregnant by him at least once before. Mary's child presents more of a mystery. She'd been married to a sailor aboard the William, a man she had apparently fallen in love with during the ship's brief career. Whether this man was the father, or whether Mary had other lovers, or whether the pregnancy was the result of some earlier encounter before she joined the crew, remains unknown. What mattered for the moment was that both women would live. Their executions were stayed pending the births of their children. John Rackham was not so fortunate. He had no belly to plead, no innocent life to shield him from justice. He was sentenced to hang at Gallows Point on November 18, 1720, just 2 days after his conviction. The sentence specified that after death, his body would be hung in chains at a location to be determined by the governor. A final humiliation, a public display intended to warn others away from the pirate's path. Rackham spent his last days in the Kingston jail, awaiting the appointed hour. He was allowed one final visitor. Anne Bonny came to see him, brought from her own cell to bid farewell to the man who had been her captain, her lover, the father of her children. What they said to each other in that final meeting has been preserved in a single devastating sentence that has echoed down through the centuries. According to the only surviving account, Anne looked at the man she had loved, the man who had freed her from a stifling marriage and given her a taste of adventure on the open sea, and she said, "Had you fought like a man, you need not have been hanged like a dog." The words are perfect in their cruelty. They are precisely calibrated to wound, to diminish, to strip away whatever dignity Rackham might have hoped to carry with him to the gallows. And they reveal something essential about Anne Bonny, about her values, about what she respected and what she despised. She did not fault Rackham for being a pirate. She did not fault him for the violence, the theft, the violations of law and custom that had brought them both to this place. She faulted him for being a coward. She faulted him for hiding below deck while she and Mary fought alone. She faulted him for the one failure that, in her eyes, was unforgivable, the failure to face danger with courage. Did Rackham respond? Did he offer some defense, some explanation, some plea for understanding? The historical record is silent. We do not know whether he accepted Anne's condemnation with shame, or argued against it, or simply stared at her in mute despair. We know only that she spoke those words, and that he went to his death shortly afterward, and that her judgment of him has shaped his historical reputation ever since. The execution took place as scheduled. John Rackham was taken from the jail and transported to Gallows Point, where a crowd had gathered to witness the spectacle. Public executions were entertainment in the colonial Caribbean, and the execution of a notorious pirate captain was better entertainment than most. The condemned man was allowed to address the crowd if he wished. This was customary, and many pirates used their final moments to express remorse or defiance, or to warn others away from the path they had followed. What Rackham said, if anything, has not been recorded. He may have followed the conventional script of the penitent criminal. He may have remained silent. He may have made some last statement that was deemed unworthy of preservation by those who chronicled his end. The mechanism of hanging in 1720 was not the relatively humane drop and snap of later centuries. There was no trap door, no carefully calculated fall to ensure a quick death through broken neck. Instead, the condemned man was placed in a cart with a noose around his neck, the other end of the rope fastened to the gallows above. The cart was then driven away, leaving the victim dangling, slowly strangling, kicking and twitching in what was grimly called the hangman's dance. Death could take several minutes, sometimes longer. It was not a good death. It was not meant to be. Calico Jack Rackham died on November 18, 1720, at approximately the age of 38. He had been a pirate for less than 2 years. His total take from piracy was modest. Some supplies, some ammunition, a few captive vessels, nothing that would have made him wealthy even if he had survived to enjoy it. He had captured no treasure ships, had never engaged a naval vessel in battle, had terrorized only the smallest and most vulnerable of targets. By any objective measure, he was a failure, a small-time criminal who had briefly plagued a small section of the Caribbean before being captured without a fight by a single privateer. And yet, 3 centuries later, his image adorns flags and T-shirts and tattoos around the world. His skull and crossbones design has become the universal symbol of piracy. His name is recognized by people who could not name 5 other pirates if their lives depended on it. How did this happen? How did a man who spent his final battle hiding below deck while women fought and died for him become one of the most famous pirates in history? The answer begins with what happened to his body. After his death, Rackham's corpse was coated in tar to preserve it against the tropical sun, then fastened into an iron cage called a gibbet. This apparatus was designed to display the body publicly, allowing it to rot slowly over weeks or months while serving as a warning to anyone contemplating piracy. The location chosen for Rackham's gibbet was a small sandy quay near Port Royal Harbor, a spot where incoming ships could not fail to see it. That quay became known, and remains known to this day, as Rackham's Cay. This was intended as humiliation, as posthumous punishment extending beyond the grave. But in the strange alchemy of memory and legend, it became something else entirely. Rackham's Cay gave him a permanence that more successful pirates never achieved. Sailors arriving at Port Royal for generations afterward would point out the quay and tell stories about the pirate whose body had once hung there. The stories grew in the telling. Details were embellished, exploits invented, courage attributed where none had existed. The man who had hidden while women fought became, in these stories, a bold and dashing figure who had terrorized the Caribbean before meeting his dramatic end. But the body on the gibbet was only one element of Rackham's posthumous transformation. The more important element, the factor that truly set him apart from the hundreds of other pirates who had been hanged and gibbeted and forgotten, was the extraordinary nature of the women who had sailed with him. Bonny and Mary Read did not fade quietly into history. Their trial, their defiance, their revelation of pregnancy, all of this became the subject of intense public interest throughout the English-speaking world. The newspapers of the era were hungry for sensational stories, and the tale of female pirates who had fought when men would not was among the most sensational stories imaginable. Reports of the trial spread from Jamaica to the other Caribbean colonies, then crossed the Atlantic to England, then propagated throughout Europe. By early 1721, Bonny and Mary Read were famous, their names known in coffee houses and taverns from London to Boston, and, inevitably, inextricably, their fame brought attention to the captain under whom they had served. You could not tell the story of the fighting women without telling the story of the man who had failed to fight. You could not marvel at their courage without noting his cowardice. Rackham became famous not for what he had done, but for what Anne and Mary had done while serving under his command. The process of legend-making accelerated with the publication of a general history of the pirates in 1724, just 4 years after Rackham's death. This remarkable book, attributed to one Captain Charles Johnson, provided detailed accounts of the lives and careers of numerous pirates, including extensive chapters on both Bonny and Mary Read. The author, whose true identity remains debated, with some scholars suggesting Daniel Defoe, wrote with a novelist's flair for drama and character. He transformed the fragmentary historical record into vivid narrative, giving Anne and Mary romantic backstories, emotional depth, and a kind of heroic grandeur that the bare facts might not have supported. The chapter on Mary Read is particularly elaborate. According to the general history, she had been raised as a boy from infancy. her mother disguising her sex after the death of an older male child in order to maintain a claim on the inheritance from Mary's dead father. She had joined the army in men's clothing, had served with distinction in Flanders, had fallen in love with a fellow soldier and revealed her sex to him, had married him only to see him die shortly afterward. Widowed and alone, she had taken ship for the West Indies, been captured by pirates, and joined their crew. Whether any of this is true remains uncertain. The general history is notorious for blending documented fact with probable fiction and outright invention. But the story it told was irresistible, and it shaped how generations would understand Mary Read and her companion, Anne Bonny. Anne's backstory was equally colorful. The illegitimate daughter of an Irish lawyer and his maid, raised in South Carolina, married young to a sailor named James Bonny, abandoned by her husband for the more exciting company of Calico Jack Rackham. The general history provided all of this and more, creating a narrative arc that moved from respectable beginnings through scandal and adventure to ultimate tragedy. Anne was portrayed as passionate, fierce, ungovernable, a woman who could not be contained by the expectations that society placed upon her sex. She was, in the telling, everything that a proper colonial lady was not supposed to be. And threading through both stories, providing the context and the setting and the fatal conclusion, was John Rackham. His sections in the general history are notably briefer than those devoted to his female crew members. The author seems to recognize that Rackham himself is not particularly interesting, that his career was short, his victories small, his courage non-existent. But the author also recognizes that Rackham cannot be omitted, because without him there would be no story. He is the hinge on which the narrative turns, the catalyst who brought Anne and Mary together, the captain whose failure made their courage so memorable. The general history did something else that would prove crucial to Rackham's lasting fame. It included illustrations, and among those illustrations was an engraving depicting Calico Jack Rackham's personal flag, the skull above two crossed swords that has since become the quintessential image of piracy. Whether Rackham actually flew such a flag is uncertain. The historical evidence is thin, but the illustration in the general history established it as his symbol, and that symbol took on a life of its own. The design was simple, memorable, distinctive. Unlike the more elaborate pirate flags depicted in the same book, skeletons holding hourglasses, figures stabbing bleeding hearts, complex allegories of mortality and violence, Rackham's flag was clean and iconic. A child could draw it. A sailor could identify it from a distance. It distilled the idea of piracy into a single powerful image. And because the general history was widely read and frequently reprinted throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, that image spread far beyond any memory of the actual man who had supposedly flown it. By the time pirates began to fade from living memory into historical legend, Calico Jack Rackham had achieved a peculiar form of immortality. His name was remembered because of Anne and Mary. His flag was recognized because of a single engraving in a single book. His body had marked a location in Port Royal Harbor that still bore his name. These accidents of preservation, the women, the image, the place, had given him a permanence that his actual career could never have justified. Meanwhile, in the Kingston jail, Anne, Bonny and Mary Read awaited the births of their children and whatever fate might follow. Mary's wait would not be long. She fell ill in prison. Some accounts say childbed fever. Others say a violent fever of unspecified origin. And she died in April 1721, perhaps 5 months after her trial. Whether her child survived is unknown. The prison records note only that Mary Read, late of the sloop William, died in custody, and that she was buried in the parish of St. Catherine. She was approximately 36 years old. She had lived more lives than most people dream of: soldier, sailor, wife, pirate, legend, and she died in a Caribbean jail cell, far from the battlefields of Flanders, where she had first discovered who she really was. Anne Bonny's fate is more mysterious. The historical record simply stops. We know she was in prison in early 1721, awaiting the birth of her child. We know she was not executed. Beyond that, nothing certain can be said. Some accounts suggest that her father, the South Carolina lawyer who had disowned her years earlier, finally intervened, paying for her release or arranging for her transportation elsewhere. Some suggest that she was released after giving birth and disappeared into the anonymity of colonial life, perhaps remarrying, perhaps returning to respectability under a different name. One genealogical tradition holds that she lived until 1782, dying at the age of 81 in South Carolina, having outlived her infamy by more than 60 years. If this is true, and it may be, then Anne Bonny witnessed the American Revolution, saw the world transformed, watched from a distance as the colonial Caribbean she had known gave way to something entirely different. Did she ever think about Calico Jack? Did she regret her final words to him, or did she stand by them until the end? Did she tell her children, if she had any, about the year she spent as a pirate, or did she bury that past so deeply that it could never surface again? We cannot know. Anne Bonny, having burned so brightly for one brief period of her life, fades into the darkness of unrecorded history, leaving behind only questions. But her words endure. Had you fought like a man, you need not have been hanged like a dog. In that single sentence, Anne Bonny defined the legend of Calico Jack Rackham more completely than any historian ever could. She established the paradox that would follow him through centuries. The famous pirate captain who was less brave than the women who served under him, the legend whose fame rests entirely on his failure to live up to it. And so, we arrive at the strangest chapter in this strange tale, the afterlife of Calico Jack Rackham, a man who accomplished almost nothing in life, but who would achieve everything in death. Not through any merit of his own, not through deeds worth remembering, but through the peculiar alchemy by which history transforms its subjects, distilling them into symbols, flattening them into archetypes, gilding their failures with the patina of romance. The 18th century moved on. The golden age of piracy, such as it was, came to a decisive close. Woodes Rogers, that relentless administrator, continued his methodical work of eradicating piracy from the Caribbean. The Royal Navy grew stronger, its reach longer, its patience shorter. The American colonies matured into prosperous centers of legitimate trade, no longer dependent on the gray economies that had once made them welcoming to men of dubious occupation. The old pirate haunts, Nassau, Tortuga, the countless hidden coves and inlets where rovers had once careened their vessels and divided their plunder, fell under firmer governmental control or simply faded into irrelevance. By 1730, the great pirates were either dead, pardoned, or forgotten. Blackbeard's legend was still fresh, his severed head still a recent memory on the Virginia coast. Bartholomew Roberts, that paradoxical teetotaler who had captured more vessels than perhaps any pirate in history, had been killed in battle with HMS Swallow off the African coast in 1722, his crew scattered, his body thrown overboard according to his own instructions. Charles Vane, that unrepentant villain who had defied Woodes Rogers so flamboyantly, had swung from a Jamaican gibbet in 1721, mere months after Rackham met the same fate. Stade Bonnet, the gentleman pirate whose early retirement from respectable life had bewildered everyone who knew him, had been hanged in Charleston in 1718. Samuel Bellamy had drowned in the Whydah wreck off Cape Cod in 1717, taking a fortune in captured treasure to the bottom of the cold Atlantic. One by one, the rovers of that brief, violent era had been swept from the seas. And yet something curious happened as they vanished. They began to grow larger. Distance, that great artist, began to reshape them. The terror they had inspired softened into something else. Admiration, perhaps, or nostalgia, or simply the human appetite for colorful villains who could be safely romanticized once the threat of them had passed. Captain Charles Johnson's General History of the Pirates went through edition after edition, expanding with each printing, adding new accounts, new characters, new details that may or may not have been true. It found readers in London coffee houses and colonial drawing rooms, in naval wardrooms and merchant counting houses. The very people who had once lived in fear of pirates now consumed tales of piracy as entertainment. The transformation had begun. And in that transformation, Calico Jack Rackham found his unlikely place. Not because his story was particularly dramatic, it wasn't, and not because his deeds were particularly notorious, they weren't, but because his story contained two women. This fact alone set it apart. This fact alone ensured that it would be told and retold, debated and embellished, questioned and mythologized. In an era when women were expected to remain safely at home, to occupy the domestic sphere, to avoid violence and adventure and anything that might compromise their essential femininity, here were two women who had done everything society forbade. They had dressed as men. They had fought as men. They had pirated as men. And in the end, they had proven themselves braver than the men around them. The story was irresistible. It contained everything a reader could want: romance, adventure, gender confusion, courage, cowardice, betrayal, and a devastating final judgment. Anne Bonny's words to her condemned lover became the punchline to a cosmic joke, the moral of a fable about what happens when a man fails to live up to his own legend. The fact that Rackham had never really had a legend to live up to, that he had been, at best, a minor figure in a violent trade, a competent quartermaster elevated beyond his abilities, mattered not at all. The story required a fallen hero, and so he became one. Throughout the 18th century, the tale evolved. Writers embellished it, artists illustrated it. Each retelling added new details, new scenes, new interpretations. Anne Bonny became more beautiful with each version. Mary Read more mysterious. Their exploits aboard the sloop William grew in scope and daring. The final battle, that sorry episode in Dry Harbor Bay when a terrified crew cowered below decks while two women fought alone, was reimagined as an epic last stand, a heroic resistance against overwhelming odds. The squalid reality of capture and imprisonment gave way to romantic tragedy. And Calico Jack himself, he became a symbol. Of what exactly depended on who was doing the telling. To some, he was a cautionary tale, the pirate captain undone by drink and complacency, who surrendered his ship without a fight and died in disgrace while his women put him to shame. To others, he was a romantic figure, the handsome rogue who had won the heart of the beautiful Anne Bonny, who had sailed the Caribbean in silk and style, who had met his end with whatever dignity a gibbet allowed. His famous calico clothes, barely mentioned in contemporary accounts, became central to his legend. His flag, that simple design of skull and crossed swords, became synonymous with piracy itself. The 19th century accelerated this process. The Romantic movement, with its fascination with rebels and outcasts, with wild nature and wilder men, found in pirates perfect subjects for its imagination. Byron could have written Rackham, and in some ways he did. The brooding anti-heroes of his verse, doomed and glamorous and fundamentally flawed, owed something to the mythology of Golden Age piracy that had been building for a century. The pirates of the Caribbean became the pirates of the imagination, stripped of their brutality and disease and desperation, clothed instead in the silk and lace of fantasy. Popular fiction took up the theme with enthusiasm. Pirate stories proliferated in chapbooks and penny dreadfuls, in serial novels and stage melodramas. The visual vocabulary of piracy solidified: the skull and crossbones, the tricorn hat, the cutlass and pistol, the parrot on the shoulder, the wooden leg and eye patch. Much of this imagery derived, directly or indirectly, from the illustrations in Johnson's General History. The engraving of Rackham's flag, or rather, the engraving of a flag attributed to Rackham, became the template for 1,000 subsequent images. It was simple enough to reproduce, distinctive enough to recognize, menacing enough to thrill. Children began to play at being pirates. This was perhaps the surest sign that the terror had faded completely. What had once been a genuine threat, a source of fear and financial ruin for anyone who depended on maritime commerce, had become a game. Boys tied scarves around their heads and brandished wooden swords. They raised makeshift flags and declared themselves the scourges of the seas. They knew nothing of the real conditions aboard a pirate vessel: the cramped quarters, the vermin, the constant threat of disease, the brutal punishments, the short life expectancy, the likelihood of death by drowning or hanging or gunshot, or any of the dozen other fates that awaited men who lived outside the law. They knew only the romance, and the romance was intoxicating. Calico Jack Rackham became one of the names these children knew, though they knew almost nothing true about him. He was a pirate. He had a famous flag. There were women in his story. Beyond that, the details blurred into the general mythology of the Golden Age, indistinguishable from a dozen other names that had survived the winnowing of historical memory. And here we must pause to consider a remarkable irony. Of all the pirates who sailed during that brief, violent period, men of genuine notoriety, genuine skill, genuine terror, why did Calico Jack Rackham's name survive while others faded? Why do we remember him and not Edward England, who captured more prizes and commanded larger crews? Why him and not Howell Davis, whose daring infiltration of slave-trading forts demonstrated genuine tactical brilliance? Why him and not any of the countless other names that appear in the historical record, flare briefly with violent incident, and then disappear forever? The answer is Bonny and Mary Read. It is always Bonny and Mary Read. Without them, John Rackham would be a footnote. He would be one more name on a long list of minor Caribbean pirates, mentioned briefly in the records of Jamaican courts, forgotten as soon as his body rotted from its gibbet. There is simply nothing else in his career that would justify remembrance. His captures were unimpressive. His violence was unremarkable. His tactics were uninspired. His leadership, when tested, failed utterly. Even his execution was routine, just another pirate hanged, gibbeted, and left to serve as a warning. But the women changed everything. Their presence aboard the William invited endless speculation. Their courage during the final battle demanded explanation. Their trial, with its shocking revelation that both were pregnant, introduced an element of scandal that no other pirate story could match. And Anne's devastating final words to her condemned captain ensured that the story would end not with a whimper, but with a rhetorical flourish that centuries of readers would find impossible to forget. Johnson understood this immediately. His chapter on Bonny and Mary Read is longer and more detailed than his chapter on Rackham himself. He devotes page after page to their backgrounds, their adventures, their trial, their fate. He understands that they are the story. Rackham is merely the frame, the excuse for bringing them together, the doomed vessel in which they sailed to their rendezvous with history. Later writers followed Johnson's lead. The women dominated every subsequent retelling. They appeared in plays and poems, in novels and operas. They were reimagined as lovers, as sisters, as rivals, as mirrors of each other. Their relationship with Rackham was interpreted and reinterpreted as romance, as exploitation, as convenience, as tragedy. They became symbols of female empowerment long before that phrase existed, held up as proof that women could be every bit as brave, as violent, as free as men, if only society would let them. And with each retelling, Calico Jack receded a little further into the background. He was there because he had to be there. Someone had to be captain. Someone had to be condemned. Someone had to receive Anne's withering judgment. But he was not the point. He was never the point. He was the cowardly foil to their courage, the failed lover to their fierce independence, the hanged dog to their fighting spirit. This is the final paradox of Calico Jack Rackham's fame. He is remembered precisely because he was forgettable. A more impressive pirate would have overshadowed the women in his story. A more successful captain would have dominated the narrative with his own exploits. A braver man would have shared Anne and Mary's glory rather than serving as their negative example. But Rackham was none of these things. His mediocrity, his cowardice, his failure, these created the empty space into which Anne and Mary could expand, becoming larger than life, becoming legend. He is famous for being less famous than the women who served under him. He is remembered for being outshone. His name survives because it was attached to a story that was never really about him at all. Consider, for a moment, how unusual this is in the annals of history. Men have been remembered for their achievements, their conquests, their discoveries, their creations. Men have been remembered for their cruelty, their ambition, their vision, their madness. But how many men have been remembered primarily for their association with remarkable women? How many have achieved immortality not through their own actions, but through their failure to match the women around them? It is a strange kind of fame, and Calico Jack Rackham wears it like the silk calico that supposedly gave him his name, colorful, distinctive, and ultimately insubstantial. Strip away Bonny and Mary Read, and what remains? A man who spent a few months stealing fishing boats and sloops, a man who was captured while drunk, a man who surrendered without a fight, a man who was hanged and gibbeted, his body left to rot in the Caribbean sun. This is not the stuff of legend. This is the stuff of obscurity. And yet, the legend persists. Walk into any costume shop in October and you will see the skull and crossed swords. Turn on any television and you will eventually encounter a pirate flying a flag that traces its lineage, however distantly, to that single engraving in Johnson's General History. The image has detached entirely from its origin. The man who supposedly flew it has been forgotten even by those who recognize his symbol. The 20th century brought new dimensions to the legend. Hollywood discovered pirates, and pirates discovered Hollywood. From the silent era through the golden age of swashbucklers, from Errol Flynn to Johnny Depp, the image of the romantic pirate has been projected onto screens around the world. And in nearly every case, somewhere in the visual vocabulary of these films, the skull and crossed swords appears, on flags, on logos, on merchandise, on everything associated with the pirate brand. And Bonny and Mary Read found new audiences as well. As women's history emerged as a field of study, as feminist scholars began recovering the stories of remarkable women erased by patriarchal historiography, the two female pirates became subjects of serious attention. Books were written about them, academic monographs and popular biographies, children's stories and adult novels. They were held up as examples of women who had defied every expectation of their era, who had claimed freedoms reserved for men, who had lived authentically in a world that demanded their conformity. In this rehabilitation, Rackham played his usual role, the disappointing male, the failed captain, the coward whose execution Anne dismissed with such contempt. Feminist readings of the story emphasized the contrast between the women's courage and the men's failure. The final battle became a parable of gender, the male crew hiding below decks, drunk and afraid, while two women stood alone against the enemy. Anne's final words were quoted and requoted, analyzed and celebrated, held up as one of history's great put-downs. Some scholars attempted to complicate this narrative. They pointed out that we cannot know exactly what happened aboard the William that night in Dry Harbor Bay. They noted that the testimony at trial came from hostile witnesses, the captured crew of the captured sloop, men who had every reason to minimize their own cowardice and maximize the women's aggression. They suggested that the story might have been shaped by cultural expectations about gender, that the courts and the chroniclers might have emphasized the women's fighting precisely because it was so unexpected, so transgressive, so sensational. These are reasonable points. History is always more complicated than legend allows, but they did not diminish the power of the story. If anything, they added new layers to it, new ways of understanding its significance. The tale of Anne, Bonny and Mary Read could be read straight, as a story of remarkable women who defied the limits of their time. Or it could be read skeptically, as an example of how gender shapes historical narrative, how stories are constructed to serve particular purposes. Either way, it remained compelling. Either way, it kept Calico Jack Rackham's name alive. By the 21st century, the pirates of the Golden Age had achieved a cultural omnipresence that would have astonished the men and women who actually lived it. The skull and crossed swords appeared on everything from children's lunchboxes to heavy metal album covers, from theme park rides to professional sports logos. September 19th was declared International Talk Like a Pirate Day, a joking holiday that nevertheless reflected the depth of piracy's penetration into popular consciousness. The Disney franchise Pirates of the Caribbean generated billions of dollars in revenue, spawning films and games and merchandise that turned the mythology of Golden Age piracy into one of the most successful entertainment properties in history. And through all of this, Calico Jack Rackham remained exactly what he had always been, a minor figure attached to a major story, a symbol detached from its source, a name without substance, a flag without a cause. His skull and crossed swords flew from countless imaginary ships, waved from countless Halloween costumes, decorated countless t-shirts and tattoos and coffee mugs. Almost no one who encountered that image knew anything about the man supposedly associated with it. Almost no one cared. This is perhaps the final indignity, the ultimate irony of Calico Jack's posthumous career. He achieved fame beyond the dreams of most pirates, beyond the dreams of most humans, but it was fame entirely divorced from self. His flag became ubiquitous while his story remained obscure. His symbol conquered the world while his name became trivia, useful only for pub quizzes and children's books about pirates. He is everywhere and nowhere, immortal and forgotten, famous and unknown. Had he fought like a man, would any of this have been different? Had he emerged from the hold that night in Dry Harbor Bay, had he rallied his drunken crew, had he died with cutlass in hand rather than surrendering without a blow, would history have remembered him more kindly? Probably not. One brave last stand would not have made him Blackbeard or Bartholomew Roberts. One moment of courage could not have compensated for a career of mediocrity. He would still have been a minor pirate on a minor vessel, captured after a few months of minor plundering, hanged and forgotten like so many others. But Anne might have spoken of him differently. Anne might have remembered him with sorrow rather than contempt, and that, perhaps, would have made all the difference, not to history, which would have ignored him either way, but to the legend that kept him alive after history had finished with him. Because it is Anne's judgment that echoes through the centuries. It is Anne's contempt that defines him. It is Anne's voice that speaks whenever his name is mentioned, pronouncing him forever a coward, forever unworthy, forever a man who need not have been hanged like a dog if only he had fought like a man. She gave him immortality, but it was an immortality of shame. She preserved his name, but only so that she could condemn it. Her final gift to her former lover was to ensure that he would be remembered always as less than she was, less than Mary was, less than the women he had led were willing to be. It is an epitaph carved in acid, and it has never faded. 3 centuries have passed, and still her words cut. 3 centuries have passed, and still Calico Jack Rackham stands in the shadow of the women who fought when he would not, who faced death when he faced only drink, who became legends while he became only the occasion for their legend. The gibbet at Dead Man's Cay has long since vanished, its wooden frame rotted away, its iron chains rusted into the harbor mud. The exact location is uncertain now, known only from old maps and older descriptions. Port Royal itself, that wicked city, never fully recovered from the earthquake that had devastated it decades before Rackham's bones were hung there. It remained a shadow of its former self, a minor port, a naval station, a historical curiosity remembered mainly for its brief period of pirate infamy. But the name persists. Rackham's Cay appears on some maps, testimony to the grim landmark that once marked the spot. Tourists visit Port Royal today, seeking traces of the Golden Age, hoping to feel some connection to the pirates who once walked those streets. They find disappointment mostly. A small town, a naval cemetery, a few museums displaying artifacts that may or may not be authentic. The glamour has faded. The danger has become quaint. Yet something lingers. In the heat of a Caribbean afternoon, watching the light play on the water, it is possible to imagine the harbor as it once was, crowded with vessels, alive with commerce and crime, a crossroads of empire where men could rise from nothing and fall to nothing with equal speed. It is possible to imagine a sloop riding at anchor, its deck busy with men preparing for sea, its captain in his colorful calico coat giving orders he barely understood to a crew that barely respected him. It is possible to imagine 2 women among that crew, disguised or not, armed and ready, already more dangerous than the man who supposedly led them. And it is possible to imagine how it ended. The night attack, the capture, the trial, the gibbet, the long decomposition in tropical heat, the gradual forgetting that should have followed. But the forgetting never came. Thanks to Anne and Mary, thanks to Johnson's general history, thanks to a flag design that happened to be simple and striking, Calico Jack Rackham refused to disappear. He clung to history like a barnacle to a hull, persistent despite being unwanted, present despite contributing nothing of value. He became a name that meant pirate, a face that represented an era, a flag that symbolized everything and everyone who had ever sailed under the black. He had done almost nothing to deserve it. He had been a mediocre pirate, a failed leader, a coward at the last. But somehow, through accidents of preservation and ironies of reputation, he had become immortal. It is, when you consider it properly, the least earned immortality in the history of piracy, and perhaps that makes it the most fitting for a man whose greatest achievement was being associated with women greater than himself. The question that haunts Calico Jack Rackham's legacy is not whether he deserved his fame. That much is obvious. He did not. The question that lingers, the question that draws us back to his story again and again, is why? Why him? Of all the forgotten pirates, the anonymous buccaneers, the nameless sea rovers who lived and died without leaving so much as a scratch on history's surface, why did this particular failure achieve immortality? The answer lies not in Rackham himself, but in the strange machinery of memory, the arbitrary processes by which some names survive and others vanish. To understand how Calico Jack became a legend, we must first understand what he was competing against, the sheer volume of pirates who should, by any reasonable measure, have eclipsed him entirely. Consider the men who sailed alongside him, the crews of the countless vessels that prowled Caribbean waters during those dying years of the Golden Age. Most of them left no trace. We do not know their names, their origins, their fates. They lived dangerous lives, died violent or obscure deaths, and were forgotten before their bodies were cold. The sea claimed them, or the gallows claimed them, or disease claimed them, and history simply moved on. They were the anonymous mass upon which piracy depended, the common sailors, the former slaves, the escaped servants, the runaways and cast-offs, and desperate men who formed the backbone of every crew. Without them, there would have been no pirate captains at all. Yet we remember the captains, when we remember anyone, and we forget the men who actually worked the ships, climbed the rigging, loaded the cannons, boarded the prizes. This forgetting is not accidental. It is the natural consequence of how history is recorded and preserved. The sources that survive from the golden age of piracy are limited and specific. Government documents, trial records, colonial correspondence, naval dispatches focus on individuals who mattered to administrators, which meant captains primarily. Newspapers of the period reported on piracy when it affected commerce or became scandalous enough to sell copies, which again meant captains, spectacular attacks, dramatic captures. The general history of the pirates, which did more than any other single document to shape how we remember this era, was structured around individual biographies, individual careers, individual personalities. Johnson had access to trial records and news reports, and he supplemented these with imagination and invention when the facts ran thin. The result was a collection of stories about men and two women who stood out from the anonymous mass. The structure itself determined who would be remembered. But even within this structure, even among the pirates who received entries in Johnson's history, Rackham's prominence is difficult to explain. His chapter is not the longest. His achievements are not the most impressive. His violence is not the most extreme. Blackbeard receives more pages and more dramatic incidents. Bartholomew Roberts receives more attention for his astounding success. Charles Vane appears as a more complex and interesting figure, his deposition and ultimate capture forming a more satisfying narrative arc. Samuel Bellamy, though his chapter is brief, offers the romance of the Whydah and the pathos of the Great Storm. Even relatively minor figures like Stade Bonnet provide more compelling stories. The gentleman pirate who abandoned his comfortable life for reasons no one could explain, who was ultimately captured and hanged despite his respectability. Against this competition, Calico Jack Rackham should have faded into the background, a minor entry in a book full of more interesting men. What preserved him was not his own story, but the stories that intersected with his. Bonny and Mary Read transformed his chapter from a brief account of failure into something unique in the historical record. They were the only women to receive significant attention in Johnson's history, the only female pirates whose careers were documented in any detail. And their careers were almost entirely contained within Rackham's career. To tell their stories, Johnson had to tell his. To explain their captures and trials, he had to explain the capture and trial of the William. To contextualize their extraordinary courage in the final battle, he had to describe Rackham's extraordinary cowardice. They made his chapter necessary in a way that his own achievements never could have. This is the first great irony of Rackham's preservation. He was remembered not for what he did, but for what was done around him. He was the frame, not the picture, the canvas, not the paint. His presence in history is the presence of negative space, defined entirely by what surrounded it. Without Anne and Mary, his entry in the general history would have been forgotten along with dozens of others. With them, it became essential reading, a chapter that audiences returned to again and again, not for Calico Jack, but for the women who fought for him and ultimately condemned him. The second great irony is the flag. Of all the pirates in Johnson's history, of all the black banners described in varying detail, Rackham's happened to survive in visual form. The general history includes several images of pirate flags, crude woodcuts that attempted to convey the designs flown by different captains. Most of these designs are complex, featuring figures, weapons, bleeding hearts, hourglasses, dancing skeletons. They are difficult to reproduce accurately and hard to remember precisely. Rackham's design, the skull and crossed swords, was simpler. It was bolder. It worked at a distance, which was, after all, the point of a pirate flag. A vessel approaching under the black wanted to be recognized quickly, wanted its victims to understand what they faced before they could organize resistance. Complexity defeated that purpose. Simplicity served it. But there is more to the flag's survival than mere simplicity. The crossed swords beneath the skull created a shape that echoed the skull and crossbones, which was not a pirate symbol originally, but a general memento mori, a reminder of death used in cemeteries and churches and wherever people wished to contemplate mortality. The substitution of swords for bones transformed the meaning. This was not a passive reminder of death's inevitability, but an active threat of death's imminence. You will die, and we will be the cause. It was elegant in its economy, memorable in its design, and it happened to be attributed to a pirate whose other claim to fame was two remarkable women. The combination of the memorable flag and the memorable women created a feedback loop. People remembered Rackham because of Anne and Mary. People remembered his flag because it was striking. The flag became associated with the women with the flag, and all three with the romantic image of piracy that was already developing in popular imagination. By the time the general history reached its third and fourth editions in the 1720s, the image of the pirate was already changing. The actual golden age was ending. The combination of amnesty programs, naval patrols, and changing economic conditions was making piracy increasingly unviable in the Caribbean. The last great pirates were being captured and hanged, their crews scattered, their vessels seized. As the reality faded, the mythology began to grow. Readers who had once feared pirates as genuine threats began to romanticize them as figures of freedom, rebellion, defiance of authority. The pirate became less a criminal and more a symbol. And symbols require visual representation. Here's where Rackham's accidental advantages compounded. His flag was simple enough to reproduce on countless surfaces: tavern signs, book covers, theatrical backdrops, souvenir items. His name was memorable. Calico Jack had a ring to it that Charles Vane or Samuel Bellamy simply lacked. And his story, properly understood, contained romance, drama, tragedy, and a satisfying moral condemnation all in one package. Publishers and entertainers could invoke Calico Jack as a shorthand for piracy itself, confident that their audiences would recognize the name and respond to the associations. The fact that the real man had been a mediocre failure was irrelevant. The useful fiction was all that mattered. This process of selective memory, of curated forgetting, is how legends are built. It operates not according to merit, but according to utility. What survives is what serves a purpose for those who preserve it. Rackham served multiple purposes simultaneously. For moralists, his story illustrated the wages of sin and the importance of courage. Even a wicked woman like Anne Bonny could shame a cowardly man. For romantics, his story provided exotic settings, doomed love, cross-dressing women warriors, everything that adventure demanded. For nationalists, and there were nationalists even in discussions of piracy, his story offered a distinctly English villain for English heroes to defeat. For commercial publishers, his story offered all of these things plus a recognizable brand identity in the form of his flag and his colorful nickname. No one preserved Rackham's memory because he deserved preservation. Everyone who preserved it did so because his story happened to be useful for their purposes. Compare this to the pirates who were forgotten. Edward Lowe, whose cruelty exceeded anything Rackham ever imagined, whose torture of prisoners became legendary even among pirates, left no visual symbol simple enough to survive and reproduce. His flag, if he even flew one consistently, was never documented in a way that captured popular imagination. His name carried no convenient nickname, no memorable epithet. He terrorized Atlantic shipping for years, caused far more damage than Rackham ever did, and faded into obscurity as a result. Christopher Condent, who accumulated more wealth in a single career than most pirates achieved in multiple voyages, who successfully retired from piracy and lived out his days as a respectable merchant, left almost no impression on popular memory precisely because his story lacked dramatic tragedy. He didn't die spectacularly. He didn't have remarkable women in his crew. His flag was complex and forgettable. His name was ordinary. By every measure of actual piratical success, Condent exceeded Rackham dramatically. By every measure of memorable storytelling, he fell short. The machinery of memory ground on through the decades following the Golden Age, and with each revolution, Rackham's relative position improved. Other pirates faded as their stories failed to connect with changing audiences. New generations encountered the general history, or more often, popular adaptations and retellings of it, and found in Calico Jack a convenient entry point to the subject. His story was complete in itself, bounded neatly by his association with Vane at the beginning and his execution at the end. It featured romantic love, gender disguise, betrayal, cowardice, courage, and righteous judgment. It was, in short, a good story, regardless of whether its protagonist deserved to be its protagonist. And this is perhaps the cruelest irony of all. Rackham became the protagonist of his own story almost by accident, because the women who should have been protagonists were not permitted to occupy that position in the historical record. Johnson's history was structured around male pirates, with Anne and Mary appearing as remarkable exceptions within Rackham's chapter rather than receiving chapters of their own. This structural choice, itself reflecting the prejudices of the era, ensured that their stories would always be mediated through his. To encounter Anne Bonny, readers had to encounter Calico Jack first. To learn about Mary Read, they had to wade through his failures. He was the price of admission to their legend, the necessary preliminary to the tales that actually mattered. This gatekeeping function sustained Rackham's prominence for centuries. Writers who wished to tell stories about female pirates had to acknowledge him, had to explain his role, had to situate Anne and Mary within his career before they could get to the interesting parts. Even works that focused primarily on the women often bore his name in their titles, their marketing, their framing. Calico Jack and his Lady Pirates, the women of Calico Jack, Rackham's Amazons. He was unavoidable, not because he mattered, but because the stories that mattered had been grafted onto his story by the accidents of historical preservation. Consider what it would have meant for history if Johnson had structured his chapter differently. Suppose he had titled it Anne, Bonny and Mary Read, with an account of John Rackham, their captain. Suppose he had focused on their origins, their motivations, their actions, treating Rackham as a supporting character rather than the nominal subject. The same facts would have been conveyed, the same story would have been told, but the framing would have been inverted, and with it, perhaps, the subsequent history of who was remembered and who was marginalized within that remembering. We cannot know whether such an alternate structure would have diminished Rackham's prominence or enhanced the women's, but we can observe that the structure Johnson actually employed served Rackham's memory at the expense of theirs. He received the title, they received the subordinate clauses. This structural unfairness compounds with time. Each retelling that takes Johnson's framework as its starting point reinforces that framework's priorities. Each adaptation that centers Rackham, even adaptations that clearly sympathize more with Anne and Mary, perpetuates the idea that he was the central figure of this story. The weight of accumulated tradition becomes its own justification. Of course, we focus on Calico Jack. Everyone has always focused on Calico Jack. The original arbitrariness of the choice vanishes beneath centuries of precedent, and what was once a simple editorial decision becomes what appears to be historical consensus. But consensus is fragile, and the truth, suppressed or marginalized, tends to reassert itself eventually. In recent decades, the balance has begun to shift. Popular accounts of the Golden Age increasingly recognize that Bonny and Mary Read are the interesting figures in this story, that Rackham's prominence is an artifact of historical sexism rather than historical merit. Books about female pirates now often begin with their stories rather than his, acknowledging him as a necessary figure, but refusing to grant him narrative centrality. Academic studies examine the ways gender shaped both the original pirate experience and subsequent representations of it, revealing how Johnson's choices reflected and reinforced the assumptions of his era. The machinery of memory, it turns out, can be adjusted. What was curated can be recurated. What was emphasized can be de-emphasized. This ongoing reassessment creates an intriguing situation for Calico Jack Rackham's legacy. For nearly 300 years, he benefited from structural advantages that had nothing to do with his actual merits. Now, those advantages are being examined, questioned, partially withdrawn. His flag remains iconic, his name remains recognizable, but the reasons for that iconography and recognition are increasingly understood to be accidental rather than earned. He is becoming, in the scholarly literature at least, a case study in undeserved fame, rather than a genuine historical figure deserving of attention in his own right. This is, one might argue, the most appropriate fate for a man whose entire career was characterized by receiving more than he deserved. And yet there is something almost poignant about Rackham's situation when viewed from a sufficient distance. He was, after all, a real person before he became a symbol. He had a life before he had a legend. Whatever cowardice he displayed at the end, whatever failures marked his brief career as a captain, he was also the product of circumstances he did not choose. No one decides to be born into poverty in early 18th century England. No one chooses the limited options available to young men of the lower orders in colonial society. Piracy was not a career aspiration for most pirates. It was a desperate alternative to worse options, a gamble taken when legal employment failed to provide survival. Rackham made that gamble, as thousands of others did. He happened to rise to command, which thousands of others did not. He happened to attract the attention of two extraordinary women, which was mere fortune. He happened to be captured and tried in circumstances that generated detailed documentation, which was mere fortune again. And he happened to be included in a book that became the foundation of pirate mythology for 3 centuries, which was the greatest fortune of all, if fame without merit can be called fortune. We can condemn his cowardice without forgetting his humanity. We can mock his pretensions without denying his existence. He was a man, flawed and frightened and ultimately overwhelmed by circumstances he could not control. The night the bounty hunters found the William anchored in Negril Bay, the night when everything came apart, he faced a choice that defines him for all of history. He could have fought. He could have stood with Anne and Mary and the few crew members sober enough to resist. He could have died in battle rather than waiting for the hangman's rope. Instead, he went below with the men who shared his preference for drink over danger, and he left the fighting to women who had more courage than he could summon. It was a human choice, even if it was a contemptible one. Fear is human. The desire to survive, even when survival means shame, is human. Rackham was not a monster for hiding below decks. He was simply a man whose courage failed him when courage was needed most. The tragedy, if we can call it that, is not that he was a coward, but that his cowardice became his defining characteristic for all of history. One bad night, one terrible decision, and he became Calico Jack the Coward forever. Anne Bonny made sure of that with her parting words. The record made sure of that with its focus on the trial, the condemnations, the contrast between his surrender and the women's resistance. No one remembers anything else about him. No one cares about anything else. The single moment of failure eclipses everything that came before. This is perhaps the final lesson of Rackham's strange career, that history is unkind to those who fail at crucial moments. But history is especially unkind to those who fail in comparison to others who succeed. Had Anne and Mary surrendered with the rest of the crew, Rackham's cowardice would have been unremarkable. Everyone would have been cowards together, and the story would have been simply another tale of pirates captured without resistance. It was the contrast that destroyed him, the undeniable fact that women, supposedly the weaker sex, had displayed the courage that men, supposedly the stronger sex, had lacked. The gender dynamics that should have worked in Rackham's favor worked catastrophically against him instead. He could not even hide behind the excuse of impossible odds, because Anne and Mary had proved that the odds were not impossible. They had fought. They had held off the bounty hunters long enough to matter. They had demonstrated that resistance was an option, and by demonstrating it, they had condemned everyone who chose not to resist. This gendered dimension of Rackham's failure resonated powerfully with 18th century audiences, which is another reason his story survived while others faded. It confirmed and challenged gender expectations simultaneously. It confirmed that women were capable of remarkable courage, which audiences could read as praise or as warning, depending on their perspectives. It challenged the assumption that men would naturally display such courage when called upon, which audiences could read as condemnation of Rackham specifically or of male pretensions more generally. The story worked on multiple levels for multiple audiences, which made it useful for multiple purposes, which ensured its preservation and propagation through subsequent generations. Modern audiences read the same story with different emphases but similar engagement. We admire Anne and Mary, perhaps more freely than 18th century readers could, unencumbered by assumptions about proper feminine behavior. We condemn Rackham perhaps more completely than 18th century readers did, untroubled by sympathies that his contemporaries might have felt for a fellow man facing the gallows. The story still works. The contrast still compels. The irony still cuts. Calico Jack Rackham remains the coward who is shown up by women, and that characterization shows no signs of losing its power to provoke and entertain. So he persists, this least deserving of legends. He clings to history's hull like the barnacle he always resembled, unwanted but impossible to remove, irritating but ultimately harmless. His flag flies on merchandise and movie posters. His name appears in books and games and songs. His story gets told and retold to audiences who barely care about him, but who cannot get to Anne and Mary without passing through his chapter first. He achieved immortality through association, survived through accident, became iconic through a combination of simple design and convenient positioning. He did not earn his place in history. He fell into it like a drunk falling down a hatch, and somehow he landed on the one spot that would keep him visible for centuries. The Caribbean sun sets on another day, and somewhere in the tourist shops of Nassau and Port Royal and 100 other places that once knew pirates, the skull and crossed swords stare out from t-shirts and coffee mugs and shot glasses. Calico Jack Rackham's flag, more recognizable now than it ever was when he flew it, marks him as the face of an era he barely participated in, the symbol of a profession he practiced poorly, the representative of a golden age that was already tarnished by the time he achieved command. It is absurd. It is unjust. It is entirely consistent with everything we know about how memory works and how legends form. He would probably be pleased if the dead can feel pleasure. He always wanted to be somebody, wanted the colorful clothing and the captain's quarters and the deference the command supposedly brought. He wanted the legend, even if he could not earn it, and now he has it for what it is worth. He is remembered. He is famous. His name means something to people who have never read a single page of actual pirate history. Calico Jack Rackham, the pirate, the legend, the coward who became an icon despite everything. Anne Bonny would have something to say about that, surely. Something cutting, something memorable, something that would burn for another 300 years. But Anne Bonny's words, like so much else about her, remain tantalizingly incomplete. We have one phrase attributed to her, delivered to Rackham on the morning of his execution, and even that survives in contested versions. "Had you fought like a man," she allegedly said, "you need not have been hanged like a dog." Or perhaps it was, "Sorry to see you here, but if you had fought like a man, You need not have been hanged like a dog, or some variation thereon, filtered through memory and agenda and the particular biases of whoever first committed the words to paper. The sentiment remains consistent across versions, even if the precise phrasing does not. Anne Bonny's final words to her captain and lover expressed contempt rather than comfort, condemnation rather than consolation. She did not weep for him. She did not plead for mercy on his behalf. She did not soften the verdict that history was already rendering. She simply twisted the knife that his own cowardice had planted. The scene itself deserves closer examination, because it reveals much about the peculiar circumstances that followed the trial and preceded the executions. Rackham was permitted to visit Anne Bonny in her cell before his hanging, a courtesy extended to the condemned man as a final opportunity to say goodbye to someone who had shared his life. This was not unusual for the period. Condemned prisoners often received visits from family, friends, and even enemies who wished to settle accounts before the final curtain fell. What was unusual was the nature of their relationship and the asymmetry of their fates. Rackham was going to die. Anne Bonny, at least for the moment, was not. She had pleaded her belly, as the legal phrase went. She claimed to be pregnant, and examination by a panel of matrons confirmed that her claim was true. Under English law, a pregnant woman could not be executed because doing so would kill an innocent life along with the guilty one. The sentence was not commuted, but delayed, postponed until after the child was born, at which point the woman would theoretically face the gallows she had temporarily escaped. In practice, many women who pleaded their bellies successfully were eventually pardoned or had their sentences commuted to transportation or imprisonment. The delay allowed time for appeals, for influential friends to intercede, for public attention to shift elsewhere. The immediate passion for execution could cool into something more measured, more merciful, more forgetful. Anne Bonny understood this calculus perfectly. Whether she was actually pregnant when she made the claim, or whether she deliberately became pregnant while awaiting trial, or whether sympathetic officials simply chose to accept her claim without rigorous verification, remains unclear. The sources do not agree, and the truth died with Anne herself. What matters is that the claim was accepted, the execution was postponed, and Anne Bonny bought herself time that Calico Jack Rackham could not buy. Mary Read made the same claim, with the same result. Both women were respited, their sentences suspended pending the delivery of children who may or may not have existed. But Mary Read's story ended differently. She fell ill in prison, likely with fever of the type that swept through colonial jails with depressing regularity. The conditions in Jamaican prisons were appalling, even by the standards of an era that did not particularly value prisoner welfare. Overcrowding, poor sanitation, contaminated water, inadequate food, and minimal medical care combined to make imprisonment nearly as dangerous as execution. Mary Read died in that prison, probably in April of 1721, without ever facing the gallows that awaited her. If she was pregnant, the child died with her. Her body was buried in the parish of St. Catherine, Jamaica, her grave unmarked and now unlocatable, her remains long since absorbed back into the Caribbean earth she had terrorized so briefly. Anne Bonny's fate is even more mysterious. She simply vanishes from the historical record after her sentence was respited. No execution is recorded, no pardon is documented, no transportation is noted. She does not appear in the prison records dying of fever like Mary Read. She does not appear in the colonial records being released or transferred. She does not appear in ship manifests departing Jamaica for any destination. She simply disappears, which has allowed historians and storytellers to speculate endlessly about what became of her. The most prosaic explanation is that her father, William Cormack, used his wealth and connections to secure her release quietly. He had the means. Despite disinheriting her after her marriage to James Bonny, he remained a prosperous man with political and commercial connections throughout the colonial world. Blood is often thicker than disapproval, especially when that blood faces the gallows. He may have paid bribes, called in favors, arranged for records to be lost or altered, and spirited his daughter away to some safe obscurity where she could live out her days far from the notoriety she had earned. Some researchers have suggested that she returned to Charlestown and lived there under her father's roof until his death, then married a local man named Joseph Burley, and raised a family of 8 children, dying peacefully in 1782 at approximately 82 years of age. This theory has documentary support in the form of land records and family genealogies, but the identification remains contested. We cannot be certain that the Anne Burley of Charlestown was the same Anne Bonny who had terrorized the Caribbean half a century earlier. Other theories abound. She may have returned to piracy under a different name. She may have fled to one of the Spanish colonies where English justice could not reach her. She may have died in prison like Mary Read, with the record simply failing to survive. She may have been quietly executed after all, with the pregnancy delay providing cover for officials who wanted to avoid the spectacle of hanging a woman publicly. Each theory has its advocates and its evidence, such as it is. None has achieved definitive proof. Anne Bonny remains one of history's great escape artists, slipping free not just from the gallows, but from the historical record itself, leaving behind only questions and legends and that single cutting phrase delivered to the man who had failed her. This uncertainty about Anne's fate has contributed significantly to the legend that surrounds both her and Rackham. Mystery is catnip to storytellers. An ending that refuses to resolve itself invites endless speculation, endless retelling, endless embroidery. If we knew exactly what happened to Anne Bonny, she would be less interesting. The story would be closed, complete, finished. Instead, she remains forever poised at that threshold between pirate and prisoner, between notorious criminal and obscure housewife, between legend and ordinary life. She might have been anything, done anything, become anything. Her openness makes her available for projection in ways that a documented ending would foreclose. Rackham, by contrast, is entirely too well documented. We know exactly what happened to him. He was hanged at Gallows Point, Port Royal, Jamaica on November 18, 1720. His body was then placed in a gibbet, an iron cage designed to hold a corpse upright while it decomposed, and hung on a small island at the entrance to Port Royal Harbor as a warning to other pirates who might consider that profession. The island was subsequently named Rackham's Cay in his dubious honor, a piece of Caribbean real estate that owes its name to the man who rotted there. The gibbet was a common fate for executed pirates, designed to maximize the deterrent effect of their deaths. A hanging was over in minutes, but a body in a gibbet could take weeks or months to fully decompose, depending on weather conditions and the attention of scavenging birds. Every ship entering or leaving Port Royal would pass the grim display, a constant reminder of the price of piracy. We do not know how long Rackham's body hung there before it was finally taken down or simply fell apart. We do not know who eventually removed the gibbet or what they did with the bones that remained inside it. We do not know if anyone mourned him publicly, though it seems unlikely. His family, if he had family in Jamaica or elsewhere, left no record of their grief. His crew, those who survived the trials and executions, left no record of their feelings about the man who had commanded them. He died as he had lived, witnessed but not particularly valued, visible but not particularly memorable, present but not particularly important. Just another pirate in an era lousy with pirates, another body in an era that produced bodies by the hundreds and thousands, another cautionary tale in an era that specialized in cautionary tales. And yet somehow, against all odds and expectations, he became the pirate. Not the most successful, not the most feared, not the most admired, but the most recognized. His flag became the symbol of an entire way of life that he had practiced poorly for barely a year. His name became synonymous with a romantic outlaw tradition that would have bewildered his actual contemporaries. His image appeared on more merchandise than any other pirate in history, his crossed swords adorning everything from children's lunchboxes to biker jackets to corporate logos. He achieved in death what he could never achieve in life: significance. The process by which this happened deserves careful examination, because it illuminates not just Rackham's peculiar posthumous career, but the mechanics of legend-making more generally. Legends do not form randomly. They require specific conditions, specific materials, specific forces to shape and preserve them. Understanding why Rackham's legend persisted while others faded requires understanding what made his story tellable, adaptable, and useful across changing historical contexts. The first factor was timing. Rackham was tried and executed at the precise moment when the Caribbean piracy era was transitioning from contemporary crisis to historical curiosity. The intense naval campaigns of 1718 1720 had broken the back of organized piracy in the region. Woodes Rogers had pacified Nassau, the Spanish had swept the Gulf of Mexico, the British had hanged pirates by the dozen throughout the Caribbean colonies. By the time Rackham swung at gallows point, the golden age was effectively over. The few remaining pirate crews were scattered, demoralized, and hunted. The shipping lanes were safer than they had been in decades. Colonial merchants and planters could finally breathe easy. This timing made Rackham's trial perfect material for summarizing and concluding the pirate era in public consciousness. He was not the last pirate hanged in the Caribbean. That dubious honor would go to others in subsequent years. But he was among the last pirates whose trial attracted widespread attention and whose story contained the dramatic elements necessary for memorable narrative. The presence of Bonny and Mary Read ensured that his case would be discussed far beyond the usual reach of maritime law proceedings. The contrast between his cowardice and their courage provided a moral framework that audiences could use to make sense of the whole pirate phenomenon. The simple, striking design of his flag provided a visual anchor that could represent everything the era had meant. Rackham's story became, in effect, the closing credits of Caribbean piracy's first act. The second factor was documentation. Rackham's trial was well recorded because it took place under British colonial justice, which kept reasonably thorough records, and because it involved unusual circumstances that prompted additional documentation. The transcripts of the trial, or at least summaries of them, found their way into the works of Captain Charles Johnson, whose General History of the Pirates became the single most influential source for pirate history and lore. Johnson devoted considerable space to Rackham, Bonny, and Read, recognizing that their story had qualities that his readers would find compelling. His account, published in 1724, shaped virtually every subsequent telling of the tale. Johnson's book was enormously popular and frequently reprinted. It provided the template for how pirates would be understood and represented for centuries to come. His portrait of Rackham, colorful, vain, mediocre, became the standard interpretation. His accounts of Anne and Mary, brave, defiant, exceptional, became the standard interpretations of them as well. His description of the final battle, with the women fighting alone while the men hid below, became the standard version of events even though we cannot be entirely certain it is accurate. Johnson was writing history, but he was also writing entertainment, and he understood that a good story sometimes required sacrificing nuance for narrative punch. The third factor was simplicity. Rackham's flag was easy to reproduce, easy to recognize, easy to remember. The skull and crossed swords required no special artistic skill to render recognizable. A child could draw it. A semi-literate sailor could scratch it into wood or daub it onto canvas. It worked at any scale, from a ship's banner to a tattoo to a tiny pendant. It worked in any color scheme, though white on black remained the default. It required no explanation, no context, no specialized knowledge to understand. You saw it, and you knew what it meant. Pirates, danger, outlaws, death. This visual simplicity proved crucial to the flag's survival and propagation. Other pirate flags were more elaborate, more personalized, more interesting as artifacts of individual creative expression. Bartholomew Roberts flew multiple flags featuring himself in various poses, toasting death or standing on skulls representing specific enemies. Edward Lowe flew a red skeleton on black. Blackbeard's flag, in the versions that have come down to us, showed a skeleton holding an hourglass and spearing a heart. These were complex images with specific iconographic meanings. They were harder to reproduce accurately, harder to remember precisely, harder to adapt for different contexts. Rackham's flag had none of these disadvantages. Its simplicity was its strength. The fourth factor was the gender dimension. The presence of Bonny and Mary Read made Rackham's story unusual in ways that guaranteed continued interest. Female pirates were rare enough to be remarkable, and female pirates who outfought their male companions were remarkable enough to become legendary. This gender reversal appealed to audiences across the centuries for different reasons. 18th century readers could enjoy it as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unmanned men and unfeminine women. 19th century readers could enjoy it as a romantic adventure featuring plucky heroines and dastardly villains. 20th century readers could enjoy it as a proto-feminist narrative of women claiming power in a masculine world. 21st century readers could enjoy it as a queering of gender expectations in a historical context. The story was flexible enough to support multiple readings, which meant it could remain relevant as cultural values shifted. Each of these factors reinforced the others. The timing ensured documentation. The documentation preserved the gender dynamics. The gender dynamics generated continued interest. The continued interest drove commercial exploitation. The commercial exploitation favored visual simplicity. The visual simplicity reinforced the timing by making Rackham's flag the default symbol of an era that was now definitively concluded and available for nostalgic romanticization. It was a feedback loop that Rackham could never have anticipated and would not have understood. But perhaps the most important factor was the paradox at the story's heart. Rackham achieved fame for failure. He became legendary for cowardice. He became the symbol of an era precisely because he was such a poor representative of it. This paradox fascinated people in ways that straightforward success stories never could. We expect pirates to be brave, ruthless, dangerous. Rackham was none of these things, yet he became the pirate whose image appears everywhere. This disjunction between expectation and reality creates cognitive friction, and cognitive friction creates interest. We want to understand how something so wrong could happen. We want to examine the mechanisms that produce such an absurd result. We keep looking at Rackham because he should not be there, and his presence in the historical record demands explanation. The irony deepens when we consider that Rackham probably would have been delighted by his posthumous fame, even if he would have been horrified by its basis. He wanted glory, he wanted recognition, he wanted to be somebody. He adopted colorful clothing and a fancy nickname and a striking flag because he understood, on some level, that image mattered as much as substance in the pirate world. He was, in his own small way, a marketer, a brand builder, a creature of surfaces and impressions. He understood that perception could substitute for reality if managed correctly. He just was not competent enough to manage it correctly while alive. Death, paradoxically, completed his project for him. The Caribbean he terrorized so briefly continued without him, of course. The plantation economy expanded. The slave trade intensified. The colonial powers consolidated their control over the islands and the shipping lanes that connected them. The pirates who had briefly disrupted this system were dead or scattered or reformed, absorbed back into the legitimate maritime economy as privateers during subsequent wars or as simple sailors on merchant vessels. The Golden Age became a memory, then a legend, then a marketing opportunity. By the 19th century, pirates had been sufficiently defanged by time and distance to become figures of romance rather than terror. Robert Louis Stevenson could write Treasure Island and expect his readers to thrill rather than shudder at the prospect of encountering Long John Silver. The actual history of Caribbean piracy, the violence, the squalor, the disease, the summary executions, the enslaved Africans who served on pirate crews under varying degrees of coercion, faded behind a scrim of colorful adventure. Rackham's flag rode this wave of romanticization perfectly. Its simplicity made it adaptable to any medium, any context, any purpose. Its association with actual historical piracy gave it authenticity that purely fictional inventions lacked. Its origin in failure and cowardice was quietly forgotten or deliberately suppressed, replaced by vague associations with rebellion and freedom and adventure. The man who had cowered in his ship's hold while women fought in his name became the symbol of bold defiance against tyrannical authority. The captain, whose crew surrendered without resistance, became the representative of an era defined by ruthless combat and desperate last stands. The dandy who probably never killed anyone in his brief career became the face of a profession that had killed thousands. If Rackham could see what his flag has become, what would he think? Would he laugh at the absurdity of it all? Would he weep at the misrepresentation of his pathetic career? Would he simply shrug, take credit for the achievement, and order another drink? We cannot know, of course. The dead tell no tales, as the pirate proverb goes, and Rackham has been dead for 3 centuries now. His bones, wherever they ended up after the gibbet finally collapsed, have long since turned to dust. His ship was confiscated and probably sold. His possessions were distributed among his captors or claimed by the colonial government. Nothing remains of the physical Rackham except the echo of his name and the image of his flag. But echoes can be powerful things. They bounce off surfaces, combine with other sounds, create resonances that the original voice never intended. Rackham's echo has bounced through 3 centuries of popular culture, combining with countless other voices, authors, artists, filmmakers, game designers, costume makers, tattoo artists, to create a resonance that bears almost no resemblance to the original sound. The Rackham of legend is a creation of collective imagination, assembled from fragments of fact and mountains of fiction, shaped by commercial interests and cultural needs rather than historical accuracy. He is less a person than a symbol, less a pirate than an idea of piracy. And perhaps that is the final irony in a story that has been nothing but ironies from the beginning. Calico Jack Rackham wanted desperately to be a symbol. He dressed like one. He named himself like one. He designed a flag like one. He understood that symbolism mattered, that image could substitute for substance, that looking like a pirate was nearly as good as being one. He was right about all of this. He was just wrong about which symbol he would become. He thought he was creating an image of dangerous glamour, of colorful menace, of stylish defiance. Instead, he created an image of failure preserved by association with success, of mediocrity immortalized by proximity to excellence, of cowardice made eternal by contrast with courage. His symbol became famous, but it came to mean something entirely different from what he intended. He is the face of piracy, and the face is a mask, and behind the mask there is nothing but a frightened man waiting for someone else to save him. The sun sets on the Caribbean, as it is set on 3 centuries of Caribbean sunsets since Rackham hung at Gallows Point. The waters are calmer now, patrolled by coast guards rather than pirates, traversed by cruise ships rather than sloops. The islands have become vacation destinations, their violent histories packaged into sanitized attractions for tourists who want a taste of adventure without any actual danger. Port Royal, that wickedest of cities, now lies mostly underwater, destroyed by an earthquake in 1692 and never fully rebuilt, its remaining ruins a tourist attraction rather than a functioning port. Nassau has become a cruise ship terminal, its pirate past celebrated in museums and themed restaurants, while its pirate present is firmly suppressed by modern law enforcement. The Caribbean that Rackham knew is as dead as Rackham himself, replaced by something glossier and safer and infinitely less interesting. But his flag endures. On those cruise ships, on those tourist beaches, in those gift shops and restaurants and museums, the skull and crossed swords stare out from every conceivable surface. Children buy them as souvenirs. Adults wear them as fashion statements. Corporations use them as logos. The image has transcended its origin entirely, becoming a free-floating signifier of rebellion, individuality, nonconformity. Qualities that Calico Jack Rackham conspicuously lacked, but that his flag has somehow come to represent. The disconnect between sign and signified has become complete. The flag means piracy in general, not Rackham in particular. It means adventure, not cowardice. It means freedom, not failure. And somewhere, in whatever afterlife awaits inadequate pirates, Calico Jack Rackham is either laughing or weeping or simply ordering another drink. He got what he wanted in the end. He became somebody, just not the somebody he thought he was becoming. The morning of November 18th, 1720, dawned gray and heavy over Port Royal Harbor. The clouds hung low, pregnant with rain that would not fall, as if the sky itself was holding its breath. In the harbor, the ship that had once been the William, the sloop that had carried Rackham's ambitions across the Caribbean, sat at anchor, under guard, its sails furled, its guns silent, its brief piratical career definitively over. The vessel looked smaller somehow in captivity, diminished by circumstance, its menacing black flag replaced by the naval ensign of His Majesty's government. It was just a boat now, just wood and rope and canvas, stripped of the mythology that had briefly clung to its rigging. In the jail at Spanish Town, the pirates waited. They had been separated by now, the men from the women, the condemned from those still awaiting judgment. Calico Jack Rackham occupied a cell that smelled of old stone and despair, the accumulated misery of everyone who had ever waited within these walls for the justice of the crown. He was no longer wearing his calico. Somewhere between capture and imprisonment, his colorful garments had been stripped away, replaced by the drab clothing of a common prisoner. The transformation was complete. The symbol had been dismantled, reduced to its component parts, revealed as nothing more than fabric and flesh. The trial itself had been swift. Colonial justice for pirates operated on a different timeline than the ponderous proceedings of English courts. There was no jury of peers, no lengthy deliberations, no complex arguments about intent or circumstance. The Vice Admiralty Court existed for one purpose: to process captured pirates as efficiently as possible and execute them as publicly as possible. The efficiency served the Crown's interests. The publicity served as warning to others who might consider the sweet trade. Rackham and his crew were cargo on a judicial assembly line, their fates predetermined by the very act of their capture. Governor Woodes Rogers had watched the proceedings with grim satisfaction. This was what he had promised the Crown when he accepted his commission: the eradication of piracy from the Bahamas, the transformation of Nassau from a lawless haven into a respectable colonial port. Every hanging represented progress toward that goal. Every swinging body on the gibbet was an advertisement of his effectiveness. Rogers had been a privateer himself once, had understood the blurred line between legal and illegal plunder, had even shown mercy to pirates willing to accept the king's pardon. But his mercy had limits, and Calico Jack Rackham had exceeded them. The man had taken the pardon and then returned to piracy. He had made Rogers look foolish. He would pay for that humiliation with his life. The formal charges were read with the tedious precision of colonial bureaucracy: piracy on the high seas, robbery under arms, acts of violence against His Majesty's subjects. The specific incidents were enumerated: this merchant vessel taken, that cargo stolen, these acts of intimidation committed. The evidence was overwhelming because the evidence was self-evident. They had been caught in the act, taken with weapons in hand, found aboard a vessel flying the black flag. There was nothing to argue, nothing to dispute, nothing to do but stand and listen as the machinery of justice ground toward its inevitable conclusion. Rackham's crew went first, a parade of ordinary men whose names have been lost to history because their stories held nothing remarkable enough to remember. They were fishermen and sailors and runaway servants, men who had joined the pirate life for reasons that probably made sense at the time and seemed catastrophically foolish now. They had followed Rackham because someone had to be followed, because piracy required hierarchy just as legitimate sailing did, because when a man flies the black flag and offers a share of plunder, other men will fall in behind him. Their following had led them here, to this courtroom, to this verdict, to the gallows that waited outside. One by one, they were sentenced to death. The judge spoke the words with practiced efficiency: to be taken to the place of execution, to be hanged by the neck until dead. May God have mercy on your soul. The formula repeated until it lost meaning, became mere sound, a bureaucratic incantation required to transform living men into legitimate corpses. The condemned received their sentences with varying degrees of composure. Some wept, some prayed, some simply stared, unable to comprehend that this was actually happening, that the adventure had ended in this small room with its smell of old wood and nervous sweat. Then it was Rackham's turn. He stood before the court in his borrowed clothes, looking smaller than the legend had suggested, older than the romantic image implied. The calico that had given him his name was gone. The pistols and cutlass were gone. The swagger was gone. What remained was a middle-aged man facing the consequences of decisions that had seemed glamorous when made, and seemed foolish now. The judge looked at him with the practiced contempt of colonial officials for those who disturbed the order they were paid to maintain. This was the famous Calico Jack, this nervous, ordinary man in ill-fitting clothes. The gap between reputation and reality must have been striking even then, even before 3 centuries of mythology had inflated the legend beyond all recognition. The sentence was pronounced: death by hanging, like all the others. But there was an addition to Rackham's fate, a theatrical flourish that elevated his punishment above the common criminals who would share the gallows. After execution, his body would be placed in an iron cage and hung at the entrance to Port Royal Harbor, left to rot as a warning to all who might follow his path. This was gibbeting, the practice of displaying executed criminals as public monuments to justice. It was reserved for particularly notorious criminals, for those whose punishment needed to serve as spectacle. Woodes Rogers wanted Calico Jack Rackham's corpse to be the first thing arriving sailors saw, a skeletal welcome to Jamaica, a reminder that the age of piracy was ending and the age of law was beginning. Rackham received the sentence without visible reaction. Perhaps he had expected it. Perhaps he was beyond expectation by now, existing in that strange, suspended state that condemned prisoners sometimes enter, their minds disconnected from a future that has become too terrible to contemplate. He had known the risks when he chose piracy. He had known the penalty when he returned to the trade after accepting Roger's pardon. The mathematics of his situation had been clear from the beginning. The odds were always against long-term survival. Most pirates died young, killed in action, or executed by authorities, or claimed by disease or accident. Rackham had beaten those odds for a while, had survived longer than many. But the house always wins eventually. Yet there remained one piece of business that history would remember, one moment of dialogue that would be preserved while everything else about the trial faded into legal records and archival dust. Anne Bonny was brought to see him before the execution. Whether this was her request or the authorities' cruelty is unclear, perhaps both. The colonial government had reasons to allow the meeting. It reinforced the moral dimension of the punishment, showed that even intimate relationships could not protect criminals from justice. And Anne had reasons of her own, reasons that had nothing to do with tender farewells. The meeting was brief. They faced each other across whatever space the guards allowed, the man who had swept her away from her comfortable life, and the woman who had believed in an adventure that had never truly existed. What passed between them in that cramped space, what unrecorded words or gestures or silences preceded the famous final exchange, we cannot know. But we know how it ended, because someone recorded Anne Bonny's last words to the man she had loved, or thought she loved, or convinced herself to love for a little while. "If you had fought like a man," she said, "you need not have been hanged like a dog." The words have the rhythm of something carefully prepared, a verdict rendered in the language of contempt. She had waited to deliver this judgment, perhaps had composed it during the long hours since the capture, turning the phrases in her mind until they achieved maximum impact. This was not grief speaking. This was fury. This was the rage of someone who had invested herself in a story that turned out to be a lie, who had followed a man she believed to be a romantic hero and discovered that she had been following a coward. All the risks she had taken, all the comforts she had abandoned, all the conventional life she had rejected. It had been for this? For a man who hid below decks when the fighting started? For a captain who surrendered without drawing his sword? The judgment was devastating precisely because it came from someone who had every reason to offer comfort instead. A condemned man facing execution might expect tenderness from his lover, might hope for words of forgiveness or affection, or at least sympathy. What Rackham received instead was final confirmation of his inadequacy, delivered by the one person whose opinion he might have cared about most. Anne Bonny did not mourn him, she despised him, and she wanted him to know it before he died. Whether Rackham responded, whether he attempted defense or explanation or even apology, history does not record. Perhaps there was nothing to say. Perhaps her verdict was too accurate to dispute, too obviously true to argue against. He had not fought, he had hidden. His crew had surrendered while she and Mary Read fought on. These were facts, immutable and damning. All his calico clothing, all his theatrical flags, all his carefully cultivated image of dangerous glamour, none of it meant anything because when the moment of truth arrived, he had proven himself false. The performance had been exposed as performance. The symbol had been revealed as empty. The execution took place on November 18, 1720, at Gallows Point in Port Royal. The location was chosen for maximum visibility, a promontory that could be seen by ships entering the harbor. The pirates were paraded through the streets, a public spectacle designed to remind the population of the consequences awaiting those who defied colonial law. Crowds gathered, as crowds always did for hangings. This was entertainment in an age before mass media, a communal experience that combined moral satisfaction with theatrical excitement. The condemned walked their last walk while spectators watched and commented, and perhaps felt grateful that they themselves had made different choices. Rackham climbed the scaffold with whatever courage or resignation or simple numbness he could muster. The noose was placed around his neck, the prayers were said, the formulas completed, the bureaucratic requirements satisfied. And then, the drop, the sudden short fall, the snap or struggle depending on the hangman's skill and the prisoner's luck. Execution by hanging was not always quick. Some men died instantly from broken necks, others strangled slowly, their legs kicking in that involuntary dance that gave rise to the gallows humor of the era. How Rackham died, quickly or slowly, with dignity or without, nobody thought to record. He was simply one more pirate among many, his death notable only because of what would come afterward. The body was cut down and prepared for gibbeting. An iron cage had been constructed specifically for this purpose, an open-work framework that would hold the corpse upright while allowing the elements and the birds to do their work of decomposition. Rackham was placed inside, the cage was sealed, and the whole apparatus was hung at the entrance to Port Royal Harbor, where every ship arriving would have to pass beneath his slowly rotting remains. He would hang there for months, perhaps years, gradually reduced from fresh corpse to dried flesh to bare bones. The gulls would take his eyes, the tropical sun would bake his skin, the salt air would weather what remained until Calico Jack Rackham became a skeleton in a cage, a purely symbolic presence marking the boundary between lawful civilization and lawless sea. It was an appropriately theatrical end for a man who had always valued theater. Rackham had understood the importance of display, had made himself memorable through visual impact, had designed the flag that would carry his image through centuries. Now he was displayed one final time, his corpse becoming the ultimate symbol, a warning to others and an advertisement of colonial power. Even in death, he remained a visual spectacle. Even in dissolution, he served someone else's purposes. But what of the women? What of Bonny and Mary Read, the true pirates of Rackham's crew, the only members who had fought when fighting was required? Their trials followed Rackham's, separate proceedings that attracted even more attention than the captain's had. Female pirates were rare enough to be sensational. Female pirates who had fought with masculine ferocity while their male companions cowered below were something else entirely. A phenomenon that challenged every assumption about gender and violence and the natural order of things. The colonial authorities did not know quite what to make of them, and neither did the spectators who crowded the courthouse to witness this singular event. The evidence against them was as overwhelming as it had been against Rackham and his crew. They had been taken aboard a pirate vessel. They had been seen fighting against Barnett's forces. Witnesses testified to their presence at various acts of piracy over the preceding months. Their disguises had not hidden their identities from those who had sailed with them. The trial was a formality, the verdict a foregone conclusion. Both women were sentenced to death by hanging, the same fate as their male companions. But then came the revelation that would save their lives, at least temporarily. Both women pleaded their bellies, as the legal phrase had it. Both claimed to be pregnant. This was more than an excuse. It was a legal protection rooted in the principle that an unborn child, being innocent of any crime, could not be executed for its mother's sins. The court was obligated to postpone execution until the pregnancies were confirmed and, if real, until the children were delivered. The condemned women were examined by medical authorities. The pregnancies were pronounced genuine. The executions were stayed. Mary Read never faced the gallows. She died in prison, probably in April 1721, of fever that was likely complications from her pregnancy. The jail was a breeding ground for disease, its crowded cells and inadequate sanitation creating perfect conditions for the spread of illness. Mary's body, weakened by months of imprisonment and the stresses of pregnancy, could not fight off whatever infection took hold. She died as she had lived, fighting in her way, struggling against an enemy she could not defeat with cutlass or pistol. Her body was buried in Jamaica, though the exact location has been lost. No gibbet for Mary Read, no iron cage, no public display, no spectacular decomposition for arriving ships to witness. She simply disappeared into the earth, her remarkable life ending in the mundane tragedy of prison mortality. Anne Bonny's fate is stranger still, because we do not know what it was. After the stay of execution, she vanishes from the historical record with a completeness that suggests either death or successful reinvention. Some historians believe she died in prison, like Mary, victim of the same diseases that killed so many of Jamaica's inmates. But there is no record of her death, no documentation of her burial, no official notice that the sentence was eventually carried out. The silence suggests other possibilities. There are theories, none provable, all tantalizing. Anne's father, the wealthy William Cormac, who had once disowned her for running off with an unsuitable man, may have intervened. Family connections, judiciously applied, have always been able to smooth the machinery of colonial justice. Perhaps he paid for her release, negotiated her pardon, arranged for her transportation to some place where she could start over. Perhaps Anne Bonny lived out her days under a different name, in a different place, became a respectable wife and mother whose grandchildren never suspected the pistol-wielding pirate who had lurked in her past. Perhaps she outlived Calico Jack Rackham by decades, grew old while his skeleton hung in its cage, died peacefully in her bed while his flag became famous. We do not know. We will never know. The records that might have told us have been lost or destroyed or simply never created. Anne Bonny's life becomes conjecture. At the moment it stops being documentation, and the conjecture can run in any direction we find satisfying. She is simultaneously alive and dead, free and imprisoned, reformed and unrepentant. History gives us a definitive beginning and a murky middle and no ending at all. We are left with questions that have no answers, mysteries that cannot be solved. But perhaps this ambiguity is fitting for a woman who had always existed between categories, who had refused to be contained by the definitions available to her. Anne Bonny would not be pinned down by expectations of femininity. Why should she be pinned down by expectations of historical narrative? Her disappearance from the record is one final act of defiance, a refusal to provide the tidy ending that official documentation demands. She escapes, in the end, not from prison, maybe from prison, but from history itself. We cannot make her into a complete story because she would not complete herself for our convenience. And so the Williams crew disperses into their various fates. The ordinary pirates hang and are forgotten. Calico Jack Rackham hangs and is remembered for all the wrong reasons. Mary Read dies fighting to the last, struggling against fever as she had struggled against everything. Anne Bonny walks out of the record and into legend, her unfinished story more powerful than any conclusion could have made it. The sloop itself is condemned and sold, becomes some other ship with some other name, carries some other cargo to some other port, eventually rots or sinks or is broken up, its wood returning to the sea from which it came. But the flag remains. That skull, those crossed swords, that elegant symbol designed by a man who understood image better than reality. It survives everything. It survives Rackham's decomposition, survives the colonial era, survives the transition from sail to steam, survives the invention of photography and film and television and digital media. Each new technology of reproduction picks it up and carries it forward, multiplying it, spreading it, divorcing it further from its origins, until it becomes something Rackham never imagined and could never have intended. On college dorm room walls in American universities, the skull and crossed swords stare out at students who have never heard of Calico Jack Rackham and would not care about him if they had. The flag means rebellion against parents, against authority, against the expectations of respectable adulthood. It means wildness and freedom and the romantic refusal to follow rules. It means everything Rackham claimed to represent and nothing he actually was. On the backs of leather-jacketed motorcyclists, the symbol travels highways that Rackham could never have imagined, adorning men and women who consider themselves outlaws in their own way, who embrace a code of freedom and brotherhood and defiance that owes nothing to historical piracy and everything to 20th century mythology. For them, the flag is tribal identification, a way of announcing membership in a community that rejects mainstream values. They do not care that its designer surrendered without a fight. They probably do not know. On the hulls of weekend sailboats, the flag provides a touch of adventurous whimsy, a wink toward excitement in lives that are carefully insured and thoroughly respectable. Dentists and accountants and middle managers hoist the black flag as they leave the marina, playing at Piracy for a few hours before returning to their mortgages and their Monday meetings. Rackham would have understood this impulse perfectly. He, too, had wanted the glamour of piracy without its actual dangers. The weekend sailors are his truest spiritual descendants, not the motorcycle outlaws or the rebellious students. On children's lunchboxes and bedroom curtains and Halloween costumes, the skull grins out at parents who do not explain its history because they do not know it. Piracy has become sanitized, made safe for consumption, its violence and desperation transformed into cartoonish adventure. The children who carry these symbols into school will grow up with a vision of piracy that has no room for cowardice, no space for the smell of rotting corpses at harbor mouths, no acknowledgement that most pirates were desperate men who died young and badly. They will imagine freedom and excitement and treasure. They will not imagine fear. And on the massive screens of multiplayer video games, on the merchandise of billion-dollar entertainment franchises, on the products of global corporations that have trademarked Rackham's image for profit, the symbol continues its endless proliferation. The Jolly Roger has become content, product, intellectual property. It generates revenue streams that would have dwarfed the total value of everything Rackham ever stole. It creates jobs for designers and marketers and lawyers and licensing specialists. It is, in the most literal sense, legitimate now, incorporated into the legal structures of capitalism, protected by the very authorities it once defied. This is the final joke, the ultimate irony in a story composed of nothing but ironies. Calico Jack Rackham, who chose piracy because he wanted to escape the constraints of legitimate commerce, has become a brand. His symbol generates more wealth through legal channels than he ever stole through illegal ones. He is, posthumously and perpetually, a successful businessman. The capitalism he rejected has absorbed his image entirely, transformed his rebellion into product, monetized his defiance. He is no longer a pirate, he is a mascot. But perhaps there is one more irony to consider, one more paradox that gives this story its strange resonance across the centuries. Calico Jack Rackham was a failure at almost everything he attempted. He was a mediocre thief. He was a cowardly fighter. He was an ineffective leader. He was captured through his own drunken negligence and died through his own inability to resist. By any objective measure, his piratical career was a disaster, notable only for its spectacular incompetence. Yet he is remembered. He is famous. His name survives when the names of far more successful pirates have been forgotten. His flag flies from 1 million masts and 1 billion products. His image has outlasted empires and outlived revolutions and remained relevant through technological and social changes that would have been inconceivable to anyone alive in 1720. How did this happen? How did failure become fame? How did the most cowardly pirate become the most recognizable one? The answer, perhaps, is that Rackham understood something important without understanding it consciously or completely. He understood that symbols matter more than substance. He understood that image outlasts reality. He understood that what you look like is, in the long run, more important than what you are. He was wrong about many things, about his own courage, about his own abilities, about his chances of survival. But he was right about this: the calico clothing, the theatrical manner, the carefully designed flag. These were investments in immortality, preparations for a fame that had nothing to do with accomplishment and everything to do with aesthetics. He created a logo. In an age before logos existed as a concept, in a world where branding meant burning marks into cattle, Rackham intuited the power of visual identity. He made himself recognizable, he made himself memorable, and while his actual deeds were forgotten, his image survived because it was designed to survive. The skull and crossed swords is clean and simple and reproducible. It works at any scale. It translates across cultures. It reads clearly, whether carved into wood or printed on fabric or rendered in pixels. It is, purely as a piece of graphic design, superb. 3 centuries after his death, this mediocre thief and catastrophic coward has achieved what he actually wanted all along. He is somebody. He is famous. His face, or rather, the face he designed, the skull that stands in for the face he actually had, stares out from every gift shop and every screen and every cheap piece of merchandise. He has won. The victory is hollow, of course. The fame is built on misunderstanding. The recognition goes to an image that has nothing to do with the person. But then again, that is what Rackham wanted from the beginning. He never wanted to be judged on his actual merits, which were non-existent. He wanted to be judged on his appearance, which was spectacular. He wanted to be seen and admired without being examined too closely. He wanted the rewards of piracy without the risks. In death, he finally got what he wanted in life. The skull grins eternally, hiding everything behind its eyeless smile. The man is gone. The symbol remains, and the symbol can mean anything we need it to mean, because there is nothing behind it to contradict us. The sun sets over the Caribbean, as it has set every day for 300 years since Calico Jack Rackham hung rotting in his cage at Port Royal. The sky turns orange and pink and finally purple, the colors bleeding into each other like watercolors, like the fading memory of a man who was never quite what he claimed to be. Somewhere, on some boat or some beach or some child's bedroom wall, his flag catches the last light of day, the white skull glowing against the black background. The symbol endures. The man is forgotten. And perhaps that was always how it was supposed to end. The coward transformed into icon, the failure preserved as triumph, the empty gesture becoming eternal truth. Calico Jack Rackham designed his own immortality, and he got it. He just did not get to enjoy it. But then again, he probably would not have fought for it anyway.